We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the first annual North Sound Regional Race and Health Equity Conference. We are so grateful that you all have decided to wake up so early on a Saturday morning to join us to talk about these important issues. My name is Erica Gadzik, and I'm a family physician at North Sound Family Medicine and Family Care Network here in Bellingham. And I practice full spectrum family medicine, splitting my time between clinic, hospitalist work at Peace Health St. Joe's, and labor and delivery at the Childbirth Center. And I will be serving as your moderator for today's event. I have no financial disclosures. And starting off, I just would like to give a huge thanks to our generous sponsors. We're here today thanks to generous financial support from our community partners, Chuckanut Health Foundation, Family Care Network, North Sound ACH, and Peace Health, all of whom have contributed to help us make this a free event that is accessible to all. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the many individuals who volunteered their time and energy over the last many months in the planning and execution of this conference. As we get started, I would encourage you all who are attendees to let us know who's in the virtual room by sharing your name, your preferred pronouns, and the organization that you work with. This morning's conference will be recorded and we'll send out the link afterwards. We will have a Q&A session with our speakers later on in the morning. And in the meantime, I would like to encourage you all to really engage with the chat box, ask questions, share responses, comments, reactions, to help us all really engage in this morning's material. Now that we have some housekeeping items out of the way, let's dive in. So starting off, I just want to give a brief definition of health equality versus health equity. Equality is when everyone gets the same resources or opportunities, but equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and it allocates the resources and opportunities needed to help us reach equal health outcomes. And the lack of health equity is what causes health disparities in our community. This was a big problem. Recent data from 2019 shows that more than 83,000 minority patients die annually in the US due to healthcare disparities each year. And this data was collected in 2019 before the COVID pandemic further exposed and exacerbated these inequities. We are also at an unprecedented moment in our country. We are juggling both a global COVID pandemic that has further exposed racial inequities in our society and a nationwide reckoning around race and police brutality. We've witnessed the tragic deaths of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, and so many others, including multiple others just in the last few weeks. We have seen that racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately impacted by COVID, both in rates of infection and delayed access to vaccines, and in having more severe infections. And it's really important to remember that even though these conversations have been at the forefront of our national dialogue recently, these issues have been present for decades and really for centuries. And people have been working to advocate and to change this for longer than all of us here have been alive. So I want to acknowledge that we are late, but we are here. For me, this last year has been a process of asking myself, how can I move from the role of a bystander, of someone who believes that racism is wrong but isn't necessarily working to change it, to become someone who's actively working towards positive change in my community. So this conference today is one part of that. It's one tiny step towards organizing and taking action. No matter where you are in your understanding of race and health equity, my hope is that today we can build on the collective mindset that we all have the power to take steps to address racism and to improve health equity in our community. So where do we go from here? What are our objectives for the day? We'll start by looking at some data regarding healthcare inequities in Whatcom and Skagit counties. We'll learn about some of the historical origins of these health inequities, and we'll transition towards what we can do about it with a discussion of implicit bias, of how to recruit and retain BIPOC individuals, and a collaborative conversation on actionable next steps. And let's be frank, race is hard to talk about. In creating this conference, we drew inspiration from the work and words of Dr. Uche Blackstock. And with that, I'd like to introduce several ideas that can be helpful when talking about race and racism. First of all, I'd like to encourage you all to come in today's meeting with a growth mindset. We are works in progress. We are not fully formed human beings. We all have room to learn, room to grow, room to evolve. And I hope that today we can all grow a little bit in our understanding of our community and the world around us. Second, a discomfort disclaimer. If there's something we talk about today that makes you feel uncomfortable, I would encourage you to sit with that, to think about why it makes you feel uncomfortable and to lean into that rather than backing away from that feeling. And finally, if you are a person of color who has experienced racism or trauma and any of this information is triggering to you, please feel free to take a break and step away as needed. One way to address health inequities is to support and nurture a diverse healthcare workforce. Later today, we'll be learning more about the opportunity and income gap for people of color in our community. And that's one of the reasons why we felt it was important to start taking steps now, today, to reduce barriers for BIPOC youth in our community who want to pursue healthcare careers. With that, we are so excited to announce the creation of the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship. This will fund an endowed scholarship that will be given annually to local Black, Indigenous, and students of color pursuing their degree in health professional fields. Our goal is to raise $150,000 to support students of color and welcome them into our healthcare team. We're starting fundraising efforts today, and we will post the link to the donation page in the chat box throughout our visit this morning, and these donations are tax deductible. Okay, I've taken up enough time. At this point, it is my pleasure to introduce Barbara Juarez. Barbara is the executive director of the Northwest Washington Indian Health Board. She's a member of Lummi Nation. She's a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother with a lifelong career of service in medicine. She graduated from MEDEX Northwest as a physician's assistant in 1981, and she went on to serve as the director for the Lummi Tribe Health Center for 20 years. She has graciously agreed to share a blessing to start off our day. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. I Shkwachil Sanasnat Kwakantanat. Good morning, all of you. My Indian name is Kwakantanat. My English name is Barbara Juarez, and I am a member of the Lummi Nation. Thank you for allowing me to join you and all the wonderful, smart, prestigious people here today that have sacrificed your day. I would just like to begin by asking each of you to, in your own way, prepare yourself as you are entering this important work. And as I ask the Creator for special blessings, I just, again, invite you to do this in your own way. Heavenly Father, they say when two or more people come together, you are present. And we come today to give thanks for this wonderful land that we live, work, and play on. We give thanks for the opportunities that we're faced with, and we are so blessed here today. We give thanks to all of the people that are spending their morning here with us, and we ask a special blessings for all of those that are suffering in the world, all of those that are suffering in our state and in our region and in our communities and in our families. We ask all for a special blessing for those that are lost in the world of addiction as their lives are so, as they are struggling. Heavenly Father, we just ask that you send a special blessing for every one of the people that are on the panel today, that we open up our hearts, that we open up our ears, that we are able to connect. And sometimes I say this, Lord, because of my own insecurities. I may know some information in my head, however, sometimes it doesn't connect in my heart because of my insecurities or because of my anxieties, Lord. And we just ask that if anybody has any anxieties out there, that we're able to let those go and allow this good work to happen today. And we say this in your name, amen. Before you do the good work, I would just like to share a little bit of information as we do this, and thinking that some of you may not have experience working with tribal people. Some of you may not have the experience seeing the life of individuals that live on the reservations or that have moved off of the reservations. And this is all I've known. This is my whole work experience, is working with and for tribal peoples. So I come with you with only that in my back pocket. So I just was to share a little bit. As sovereign nations, tribes are increasingly involved in public health activities, regulations, service delivery, and self-governance is terms that you may hear, which really assumes the responsibility associated with the funding and to carry out programs, services, and functions and activities that were previously provided by the federal government. And as we are faced with the emerging threats of public health, it takes a team. It takes all of us. And sometimes when I say things out loud, it's because I may need to hear that. And as a strong Indigenous Native woman, I have tended to try to do everything all by myself and know that that doesn't work. And so when I share that it takes a team of us, that gives me gratitude that there is so many people out here willing to embark on this important work. Public health practitioners, law enforcement, certainly information technology, such as we're all doing this via Zoom, others working in the field to address the legal issues, the public health policy issues, to respond and mitigate some of these things that we're facing today. Our ancestors recognized themselves as distinct cultural and political group, exercised governmental authority over our lands, our resources, our people, and our culture. The Point Elliott Treaty of 1855 is really between the tribes in Washington state and the United States of America, in which that we ceded thousands and thousands of acres. We relinquished lands in exchange of, among other things, healthcare. Indian Health Service was the very first prepaid healthcare system in the United States, and it has historically been underfunded. It encompasses public health, physical health, mental health, pharmacy, lab. Although unique, I think that there are many things that can be learned and shared amongst the Indian health care system. Medicare and Medicaid have long been our history of financial support for healthcare for those eligible. And I just want to share a few things. Like prior to 2007, Indian Health Service paid in full when individuals visited the hospital. And since Medicare-like rates, that our contract health services really have continued to go a little bit further. And the reason I mention some of these points in history, it is again because our ancestors have prepaid for our health services. And sometimes we equate health with wealth. And when I mentioned to Erica about my own self and describing who I am, wealth for me is my family. Being a grandmother, being a great grandmother, being a mother, being a sister, that defines my wealth, not what I make or what I'm actually worth or not. So I just would like to ask that when we addressing data and disparities to move towards equity, these are personal stories, and I do know that you're going to be talking about stories today and the importance of personal stories. The data from tribal communities are painful. They're my family, they're my relatives. And so I just just really close to home when we talk about data and disparities among Native Americans. So I just ask that you just keep that in mind. As you begin to attempt equity, I just must remind you that the first people of this great nation have much to offer. We are resilient, although numbers are small. The gifts, talents, and sacrifices of tribal people must be acknowledged, and we thank you for being at the table. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you so much for sharing that blessing with us today. I think that is such an important reminder that when we talk about these numbers and these statistics, every one of the people behind those statistics has a family, a mother, a sibling, a father. They are parents, they're cousins, and that's such an important message to remind us why we're all in this work together to help advance health equity and community. It's to help the people in our community live healthier, happier, longer lives and have more quality time with their families. So thank you so much, Barbara. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Chow Ying Wu. Dr. Wu is a family physician at North Sound Family Medicine with Family Care Network. After he earned his bachelor's degree in social anthropology from Harvard, he served in the U.S. Job Corps before attending the University of Washington for medical school. He then worked as a family physician in the U.S. Public Health Service at the Shiprock location in New Mexico, Northern Navajo Medical Center for 5 years before moving to Bellingham with his wife, Sue, and their 2 now adult daughters. He's volunteered with the Mount Baker Ski Patrol for more than 20 years, and he also serves on the Chuckanut Health Foundation Board and the WAFP Foundation Board. He has been a central force behind Aging Well Whatcom, a community initiative that aims to make Whatcom County a place where the culture, physical infrastructure, and social support and services help all of us age well. And his clinical practice involves treating patients with chronic pain and opiate use disorder. Dr. Wu, thank you so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes, all right. I've got a box that I'm not familiar with. Okay, there we go. Well, good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Barbara, for your words and your blessing. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this conference. That would be Rachel Lucy, Director of Community Health for Peace Health, and my FCN Family Care Network colleagues, Ariel Furtado, ARNP, and Dr. Erica Gadzig, who's been moderating. And I want to thank them because not only has this been a lot of work, but I want to acknowledge that this is work that takes a lot of bravery at this particular time. And it's an example of what it is to be an ally in this moment. So thank you very much. I also want to thank you for being here this morning, sacrificing a precious half Saturday to join us when you could have been outdoors with your family, enjoying this wonderful homeland that we have, and instead you're connected to yet another Zoom session. I appreciate that you're taking this time to learn more about how we can do better and how we can be better at taking care of each other, ourselves, our families, our friends, our neighbors and coworkers, and our entire community. Now, I've been asked to speak this morning about local health inequities, and right off, I want to acknowledge that there are many types of inequities. There are many types of discrimination. In this session, I'll be focusing on inequities based on race, but I want to acknowledge that there exists discrimination based on gender, gender identity, age, sexual orientation, religion, and so many other axes of injustice. But today, I'm going to focus on race, not meaning to discount any other type of inequity. So Oxford defines inequity as a lack of fairness or justice. I like this definition by Margaret Whitehead from 1992 that's been widely cited since then. Health inequities are health outcome differences that are avoidable, unnecessary, and unjust. So those are 3 key words to hold on to: avoidable, unnecessary, and unjust. And for an immediate example, just sit back for a moment. Please think about the last 15 months and wonder how much of the health outcome differences that we've observed, that we're just living through even now, how much of this was avoidable, unnecessary, and unjust. Now, at this point, I should share my screen. Should I do this right? Erica, give me a thumbs up if that worked. Yes. Okay. So I'm a doc with Family Care Network, as Erica said. I have no financial disclosures, but I do have some disclosures to make. I'm a family doctor. I am not an expert in this area. I have no formal training in public health. And importantly, I did not collect or author the data I'll be presenting. There are people virtually present today in this meeting who are far more knowledgeable about this data than I am. And on your screen, you see a partial list of some of the people and groups who deserve all the credit for this information and for bringing this story home to Whatcom and Skagit counties. I want to thank them and thank their teams for this important work. And so since this is a talk about inequity, let's pause together before we get to the data part of this talk and examine why it is, how it is that I am the person talking to you this morning. I'm not the collector or the author of this data. Why am I the speaker? May it be because I'm a doctor, because I am male, because I am older, because I'm a person of color? Does it increase the impact or the attendance to have an older male clinical physician present rather than a younger, more expert female who doesn't happen to be a physician? What does this say about our biases? You can see that the contributors on this acknowledgement slide are almost all women. And this entire CME has been organized by 3 very dedicated women who put in many hours of their own time. And yet our speakers are predominantly male. I know this may seem off topic, and these are uncomfortable topics, but I want to acknowledge that injustice can take many forms. And let's also be aware of the context of the data surrounding the data that I'll be presenting. So data drives decision-making, at least we hope that it does. But the data itself can be a source of misguidance because bias can be built into how the data is collected, how the questions are asked, and what questions are asked. You know, we tend to collect data that reflects what we think might matter, but we don't know what we don't know. Having said that, I believe in the data that I'll show you today. I know that extensive efforts were put into hearing all the voices in our community. I know it's not perfect, but it's a good start. It's important, and I think it's powerful. So I agreed to speak on this topic today, and here's why. The work of eliminating healthcare inequity and health inequity is really important. It needs to get done. And when I said I would support this work, this was the assignment I was given. I think of myself as a foot soldier in this campaign. My job today is to present and to amplify this information and to amplify the voices of the individuals and organizations doing the real work. And the other reason is because this is my home. And over these years, my patients and my colleagues have taught me that change, even really hard change, is possible, and so I'm hopeful. Now, if we do our jobs well today, the next 4 hours are going to be filled with a lot of information and possibly a lot of emotion. So I'm going to borrow a phrase that my daughter uses, my older daughter uses, when teaching challenging material. She says, please bring your best brain. Some of what we present may trigger strong emotions, possibly heightened emotions of fear, threat, resentment, anger, and loss. And when we're in this state, we're not as capable of being open, of seeing or hearing, and we're not as creative. So when this happens, if you notice a change in your breathing or your posture, your heart rate, if you experience a strong reaction, I invite you to take a moment and just breathe. And I use this acronym, for which I thank Mindfulness Northwest for teaching me. So the acronym is RAIN. R for recognize what you are experiencing. A for allow the experience, turn towards it with openness. I for inquiry, which is gentle and non-judgmental. This is where some people use the term leaning in. And N for non-identification, which means that you recognize that the experience you're having and you are not one and the same thing. And hopefully this will help you. I use this a lot, especially when I'm getting a strong reaction to emotion or information that feels like it's directed or targeted at me, and I need to still be functional. Okay, so with all that introduction, let's look at some of the data. As many of you know, on April 8th, 2021, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, the director of the CDC, declared that racism is a serious public health threat, citing not only the disparate impact of COVID-19 on minority populations, but also that the way, the way that COVID-19 is playing out is yet one more manifestation of a much more chronic systemic problem. So I'll quote from her announcement. The data show that racial and ethnic minority groups throughout the United States experience higher rates of illness and death across a wide range of health conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, obesity, asthma, and heart disease, when compared to their white counterparts. Additionally, the life expectancy of non-Hispanic Black Americans is 4 years lower than that of white Americans. And take a look at this list of diagnoses. These are common. We see these in our offices every single day. So this is a large scale, widespread, pervasive problem. And with COVID-19 on our minds, let's look at this slide. And I apologize. I know that I don't like to read slides to people, but I know that many people are calling in on their phones and working off of small screens. So I'll summarize the best I can. So the thing that gets me about this data, and this is from the National Institute for Healthcare Management, and this is national data, is how unsurprising it is. The minorities, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, Latinos, Black Americans are experiencing 2.9 to 3.6 times the rate of hospitalizations and 1.2 to 1.5 times the rate of death compared to white Americans. And closer to home, this is the Washington data, right? You can see that the Latinx population is disproportionately burdened with COVID-19 infection. A little math tells you that they have about 2.3 times the average case rate and 1.7 times the hospitalization rate of the Washington state population in general, even though they're a much smaller part of the population. And I counted up in one 8-month period from March through October of last year, the Latinx population in Skagit County had over half of all the COVID-19 cases in that county, despite being only 18% of the population. In Whatcom County, I don't have a slide for this, and there's a caveat that in Whatcom County, the data, 21% of cases don't have assigned ethnicity or race, but the COVID infection rate in the Hispanic population was 3.1 times that of the white population, and it was 4.2 times higher in the Alaskan Native American population. Now, let's take a step back and look at just the basic demographics. Total population, so this is Whatcom and Skagit, Whatcom on the left, Skagit on the right. It's not going to be a surprise to anybody that we're predominantly white counties. The percentage identifying as Hispanic or Latino is higher in Skagit, 18% versus 10% in Whatcom. Black is 1% in both counties. American Indian, Alaska Native, 3% in both counties. Asian, 5% in Whatcom, 2% in Skagit. Less than 1% Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, and 4% multiracial in Whatcom, 3% in Skagit. You'll notice that these numbers don't add up to 100%. They add up to more than 100%. And that's primarily because the Hispanic population also identifies oftentimes as parts of other ethnic groups. All right, so where do the disparities come from? That means we need to start with our children. Whoops, children. So just think, what's this? Maybe this helps. So kindergarten readiness, there are 3 things about this slide to point out. First of all, the racial group with the highest rate of school readiness is the white population, but that rate is only 54%. And doesn't it seem like really 100% of our kids should be ready for school when they start school? The percentage of children ready for school drops down to 44% for multiracial families, 27% for Hispanic families, 23% for our Alaska Native American Indian population. And these are pre-COVID numbers, 2017 to 2018. The Black students are not represented because just of small absolute numbers. Now, we know that kindergarten readiness relates to much longer term outcomes in education, health, substance use, economic outcome, and criminal justice. So take a moment and think about, let this soak in. These children are 4 to 5 years old, and they are already getting sorted into tracks that will have lifetime profound impacts. How did this happen? Did these kids make such bad choices by the time they're 5 years old that they deserve to be tracked like this? Do they need to start pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps at age 4? Or maybe we should stop and ask ourselves, is this avoidable? Is this unnecessary? Could it possibly be unjust? Now, if we move ahead to 10th grade, this is 10th graders reporting depression. And a few things to call out here. This is not formally diagnosed depression. This is an affirmative response to a screening question. Second thing to point out, the overall rate seems quite concerning for all racial groups. The group with the lowest rate is still 27% of depressive symptoms in 10th grade. And then most of the racial groups are clustered in the mid-30s to mid-40%, which is quite concerning. And our Alaska Native American Indian group is at 66%. And in general, as we look at these health effects, I'll point out that these are big effects. You know, when you think about the kind of drug studies that we get and studies in other areas like cardiovascular disease and cancer, you know, we're often looking at small differences, 10, 12% that we think are really significant. Compare that to what we're looking at here. These are big pervasive effects on a whole population basis. Let's move on to graduation rates. So this is another surrogate marker for safety, health, and prosperity. And which of our children at age 18 to 20 don't deserve a fair shot at that? So this again points to concerning differences by racial groups. White and Asian students have a substantial advantage compared to multiracial Hispanic and Alaska Native and American Indian students. The Black students are not represented here due to small absolute numbers, which is in itself some concern. But on the positive side, the gaps appear to have narrowed during the school years. So that's a big thank you to our schools and teachers for getting that job done as the best they can. So then you get out of school and you have to make an income. And I apologize that some of this data is Whatcom centric, but we do have data for both counties. So this is Whatcom County median household income. And these numbers pretty much speak for themselves. This is pre-COVID data. Rounding to the nearest $1,000, incomes range from $59,000 in Asian families to $55K in white families, $41K for Hispanic families, $32K for multi-ethnic and American Indian Alaska Native families, and just under that for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander families, and then $24,000 a year for Black families, which is well under half the county average. For Skagit County, the flipped a page. For Skagit County, the trends are similar, but there's a smaller degree of disparity between groups. So that's of interest. And, but still, the trends are there. And again, the Black population is significantly disadvantaged compared to all the other racial groups. Okay, now let's move back to some strictly health data. Life expectancy at birth, and this is Skagit County first. And you can see the state average and the Skagit County average are very, very close here. Life expectancy at birth for the Black population in Skagit County is on par with the white population. The Alaska Native American Indian population and the Pacific Islander population are at an 8 to 9 year disadvantage. And the Asian and Hispanic population have a 4 to 7 year advantage respectively. So remember Dr. Walensky's statement at the beginning, where she was citing a 4-year difference as being really significant nationwide. And here we're looking at 8 to 9 year differences. Now moving on to Whatcom County, again, life expectancy at birth, these are all pre-COVID numbers. The Whatcom County disparities are greater. The Asian and Hispanic populations still have an advantage, but have switched positions. And in Whatcom County, the Black population has a 5.8 year disadvantage compared to the white population, whereas they were on par in Skagit County. And the Alaska Native American Indian population is at a 12.1 year disadvantage compared to the white population. And the Pacific Islander population fits somewhere between the Native American and the Black population. Another way to look at life expectancy data is here in potential years of life lost. So there's a couple things to pay attention to here on this graph. Note the years at the bottom, 2014 to 2019. Again, this is pre-COVID. With small populations, you can get these big perturbations from relatively small events. So this is data where you take a population and you make it as if each group was 100,000 people. So you're normalizing to a standard population of 100,000 people. And over here on the left, you see total years of potential life lost compared to age 65. So what that means is that if you die at 65, your contribution to these numbers is 0. If you die at 75, you don't appear in this data at all, your contribution is 0. But if you die at 64, then you contribute 1 year to this cumulative years of life lost. Now, so I know these colors can be hard to see on a small screen. So I'll just say that the, the white population, the Asian population, the Hispanic population are clustered together, fairly close between 0 to 4,000 years of life lost per 100,000. The Pacific Islander population is up here at around 7,000 years of life lost compared to the standard, and then almost 10,000 years of life lost for the American Indian and Alaska Native population. This is Skagit County. Whatcom County, the year spread is slightly different, same idea, all pre-COVID. And note that the Asian and Pacific Islander populations have been grouped together here, so that probably is masking something. The Hispanic population still has an advantage compared to the white population. Black population here losing almost more than 5,000 years of potential life lost. And up here, between 9 and 10,000 years of life lost for our American Indian and Alaska Native neighbors. Now, hearkening back to what Barbara said, these are big effects, and these are not just numbers. These are our friends and family. Every one of these years is a person who was taken from our community too soon, leaving behind a void that really can't be filled. They have faces, names, relationships, and community, and they diminish all of us. So thank you for listening. I know this went pretty quickly. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I can't see you, so I have no idea how this presentation has landed with you. I don't know where you're at in your feelings. You may be skeptical of the entire premise that racism impacts health in America. You may be concerned and not sure how to proceed. You may be committed and frustrated. You may be angry. You might be enraged. You may be heartbroken and worn. And you may be all of these things. So I'm going to borrow and paraphrase some language that I first heard at the Congregational Church on Cornwall. No matter who you are or where you are on this journey, there is a place for you in this work. Now, I know it's been a tough 15 months, and maybe you're tapped out, and I get that. And sometimes taking care of yourself is the best start. You may hear a knock on the door now, and you can't answer it right now. But maybe next time you'll hear that knock and you'll know what it is. Maybe you do have a little energy and curiosity left over at this time. And so here are a few things that have helped me. Sometimes pausing and taking stock can be useful. Learning to look around and see where you have advantages, and then figuring out how to dismantle and give away some of your advantage can be empowering for others and eye-opening for yourself. And I want to thank Su Ling Zhao of the Racial Equity Commission for formulating that idea for me. My daughter said to me recently, this is my younger daughter now, said the fundamental unit of justice is relationship. And sometimes being silent a moment longer than normal can open the way to a more full experience of another human being. And that can lead us towards justice, because seeing the fullness of another person, their story, their trauma, their bravery, acknowledging that can help us stop adding to the harm that healthcare systems can inflict on so many of our neighbors. And I'll close with one other quote from the Talmud that my daughter sent me, because she knew I was pretty nervous about giving this talk. So she said, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, Walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu, for that lovely talk and for helping shed some light on the local health disparities that we need to address as a community. I think it's so important as we hear about all of these national issues that we're really taking a look at our own backyard or our own communities and saying what's happening right here in our clinics, in our schools, and our neighborhoods. So moving on, to help us better understand some of the underlying reasons behind these health disparities that Dr. Wu just mentioned, we thought it would be helpful to understand some context and history of our region with regard to its racial and ethnic history. So with that, we approached Dr. Josh Ceretti, who's one of the associate professors in the Department of History at Western Washington University and is the interim director for Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, to help us explore the history of Whatcom and Skagit counties. He also has researched and organized various walking tours that examine important aspects of the racial history of Bellingham. Unfortunately, Dr. Ceretti was unable to join us today, but he was kind enough to pre-record a video, which we'll now share. And as you all are watching this, I'd like to invite you to reflect. Is there anything that's new to you, that surprises you? Is there anything that you learned that affects you? Feel free to drop comments and responses into the chat box as we watch.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Chuckanut Health Conference. I'm Josh Ceretti, and I'm here to talk to you for the next 20 minutes or so to give us some context to better help us understand some of the histories of racial injustice in this region that have an enormous bearing on contemporary health inequalities. So let's begin. First off, who am I? Right? I'm Josh Ceretti. I'm a white man living on Coast Salish land, and we can see above me this map that helps us think about how Western Washington, which we might think of as the Northwest, as the fourth corner, is really at the heart of Coast Salish territories that were crossed by that colonial border between the US and British empires. Today, what I'm going to talk about are really quickly 150 or 170 years of history, bringing us from the 1850s to today in three kind of swipes. Each is going to play off of this term white space. And for those of us who have been in Western Washington for a while, we're maybe familiar with hearing people talk about the problem of this being a very white space. Well, we want to understand that that didn't happen by accident. That's not a natural fact of this place. Rather, it happened through historical processes, right? It's not something that we just need to idly wonder about. Why is this region so demographically imbalanced? Why is it so white? Why is it such a white space? Well, let's learn a little bit about that today. So we'll begin by talking about white space in the late 19th century and the formation of Washington Territory as a white space. Then we'll use the term white space as it's used in a different field, in management, to talk about the first half of the 20th century, to think about forced removal and think about how these histories of occupation, of state violence, and then of informal violence that the state allows to happen, how this history and these stories got erased, right, and were undertold. For our last third there, we're going to talk about the concept of white space as it's used in the field of programming. And we're going to talk about how this erasure can create these fantasies of innocence, in this sense that those of us who are here today have no obligation or connection to the past, when in fact, as we will see, the past is very much present in all that we do. So let us begin by talking a little bit about white space. So in the visual arts, white space is the portions left unmarked, right? It's what is marginal to the visual elements that are designed. So you can see that the Google logo sits on a field of white space. But even though white space is figured as marginal, we want to understand that that doesn't mean it's unimportant. In fact, it's crucial, right, for constructing the visual elements that our eyes focus on and that we find most appealing. Important for us to also understand is that in the discourse of the visual arts, white space is negative space. And that's important for us to understand because the creation of white space is a process of negation. We want to understand that this white space was not built upon a blank slate, but was really built on a foundation of thousands and thousands of years of Coast Salish life on this land. When the first arrivants came from Europe and elsewhere outside of Turtle Island in the late 18th century, they began a process of contact that accelerated rapidly in the mid-19th century, around the late 1840s and early 1850s, as we see an onrush of new white visitors to this place that are going to become more permanent visitors. See, a lot of those early explorers, Vancouver, Malaspina, they came, they visited, they left. But this round of Americans coming in the 1840s and 1850s come with the intention of staying. And that leads us to looking at the Western Washington treaties, right? These treaties that form the basis of a lot of our presence there. And for those of us who are non-native, our presence here is very much underlined by these treaties. These treaties were negotiated in a very rapid series of events by a man named Isaac Stevens. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He worked for the railroad industry, looking to build a rail line from St. Paul, Minnesota, out here to what is now Seattle. And he came to force these treaties upon people whether they wanted them or not. Really rapidly, right, in the course of about 13 months, Stephen negotiates a series of treaties that were written before he even arrives in the area. And as we can see, there is a context of both dissent and coercion that needs to be understood. So we can see the quote from a Snoqualmie leader who refused to sign that treaty. And we can also see Isaac Stevens' threats to the people who might think about not signing it. These treaties are going to affect an enormous change in how the land here is held, is controlled, right? Because it's going to shift sovereignty out of the hands of Coast Salish people, and especially out of the hands of Coast Salish women who've controlled it for thousands and thousands of years. Instead, these treaties, which are only signed by men and only negotiated by men through a complex translation process, right? Where the Lushootseed and Lakhtamish speaking native people of this region have to communicate through an intermediary language, Chinook jargon, in order to have it translated into English and then back and forth, leading to a really complicated process. So we want to understand as a fundamental condition and thinking about how this place went from Coast Salish territory, which it had been since time immemorial, thousands and thousands of years, really rapidly is incorporated into the US state and is filling up with white settlers who are arriving because of this Donation Land Claim Act that says that if you are white, male, and present, that you can get a large portion of land for free. And if you're married, you can get twice the land, coupled with a military occupation, right? And so when we look around, if you travel around the Puget Sound region, right, we would think about places like Fort Steilacoom, right? Or we think about a place like Fort Bellingham. We would recognize that throughout this region were scattered a number of military outposts because this place only transitioned from Coast Salish territory into US territory with a military occupation. And that military occupation underlies what we're experiencing here today, right? And we could think about how the US military continues to have a strong presence in this region in a number of ways, but we also want to be thinking about how this system, right, keeps tribes politically marginal, right? And that even though they remain sovereign entities, very often the space around them is so controlled by non-native people that there are incredibly negative effects spiraling down even long after this period of invasion of the 19th century has shifted. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to shift forward and talk about the early 20th century and talk about the concept of white space as it appears in the field of management. So what we see here is that white space is the area on an institution's organizational chart that is in between the various duties, roles, and responsibilities that the org chart demarcates. So when we're talking about white space, what we're talking about in the discourse of management is an area where no one is responsible. And that's what we're going to start to see, a shift, right? As the demographic balance shifts in favor of these new white arrivals, we see that the military occupation in many ways recedes, but is not replaced by institutions that are truly going to protect everyone in this region. And in fact, what we see in the first half of the 20th century is an incredible amount of violence carried out by local white residents that is mostly ignored or allowed to continue by the local authorities. It's cast into that white space where no one is responsible. When, for example, we see the exclusion of people of Chinese descent in the 1880s. And these violent riots, people are forced out of their homes, people are attacked in the streets, and they're sent all over, pushed away, right? Pushed out of this space that is in many ways established to be, in this moment, white only, right? And building upon a tradition that is older in this region, given that as a part of Oregon Territory when it was established, there was a clause that excluded people of African descent from being able to move here. Then we see the anti-Asian sentiment that arises in the 1880s, continues in 1907 with anti-Punjabi riots in Bellingham, goes on throughout the decades. In the 1930s, we see anti-Filipino sentiment and attacks on Filipinos in King County. We see in the 1940s anti-Japanese sentiment building up in a way that leads to Japanese internment and the removal of many Japanese farmers from Bainbridge Island and all the way Whatcom County, Skagit County, King County, all over the region are taken and sent to a concentration camp at Tule Lake or at Manzanar. And of course, during the same era, right, we see a continuation of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous sentiments. They're all bound up in each other, right? In the sense that there is an attempt to mark this as a white space. The very open popularity and practice of the Ku Klux Klan in this region, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, and then the Silver Shirts, who are a pro-fascist organization in the 1930s and 40s, tells us that really quickly that sense of this place as a white space was something that many people, many white residents took up as something they wanted to defend with their own hands, right? And so it didn't take the US military to, for example, force Punjabi people out of Bellingham in 1907. Rather, white civilians did it themselves, and the government stood by and watched, didn't interfere, didn't attempt to protect or defend these people who were seen as not belonging in this white space. And of course, during this era, we see a continuation of that anti-Indigenous sentiment that most clearly manifests in violence to the land. And so from the very start of the first white settlers coming here, cutting down trees, digging up coal, diverting streams and rivers in order to create mills and other industry, all of this amounts to an enormous amount of violence against the land. And we want to understand that for Indigenous people, the land is very much inseparable from the South. It's a relation. And so to do violence to the land means to do violence to its native people. This really takes extreme form when we look at the rivers and streams of Western Washington, many of which were dammed, were horribly polluted, and were the site of a variety of extraction strategies from fish traps to trawlers that sought to deny Coast Salish people access to one of their most central and sacred resources, the keystone species of this ecological environment, the salmon, right? In the early 1970s with the Bolt decision that comes out of a long period of struggle where Indigenous people, led by people like Billy Frank Jr., are pushing to exercise those treaty rights, right? And those treaties guaranteed Indigenous people the right to fish, but the practical kind of carrying out of the treaty meant that there were very often not fish for them to catch because the government was not going to protect this resource or the people who relied on it, and rather was allowing these trawlers and these fish traps to devastate salmon stocks. Now, the Bolt decision is going to give the tribes a much stronger role in this, and is very controversial. So we see this image, right, from Friday Harbor, right after the Bolt decision, where a lot of non-native fishermen were really bitterly cutting back against that decision and against the new power that tribes were able to take back through that decision. This is as we will see throughout, we're only scratching the surface or getting the tip of the iceberg of everything we might look at this era, but we're going to move on to talk about the last 50 years or so, again relying on the concept of white space, here used in computer programming. So at the University of Durham in the UK, they've invented a programming language called white space that relies on spaces, tabs, and line breaks in order to code. That's to say that white space ignores all non-white space characters, right? It's only about the number of blank spaces or white spaces that are in between the characters that customarily form the basis of coding. What's important for us to understand about white space is that it can easily be coded into another language, right? You can have something coded in a standard programming language that has a white space program running in the background. And that brings us to be thinking about contemporary manifestations of white supremacy that often manifest in ways that are considered to be non-racial or non-racist or post-racial or perhaps colorblind, right? What we actually see, though, is in this region, it becomes a way to ignore the history of white supremacy as well as its ongoing relevance. Classic example of this is thinking about King County. King County was named after Rufus King, a ferocious Alabama segregationist, a hateful slave-owning racist. And then in the 1980s, King County was renamed King County after Martin Luther King Jr., right? No need to change the name of the county, no need to really change any of the fundamental components and constitution of it, but we can flip it over, right? And now we've renamed it and it tried to disconnect from that history of white plantation South racists coming here, making a home here, and really not just making a home here on the margins, but making this their kind of space, getting whole counties named after them. And so we want to think critically about the way that, for example, the enjoyment that many people in Western Washington have with outdoor recreation, kayaking, canoes, and hiking, the way that that enjoyment of the land is tied to those treaties and the exclusion of Indigenous people from their land. Or we could think about, for those of you who are into canning and organic food, how we talk about homesteading a lot here, right? And that homesteading is a popular activity for a lot of non-native people who feel like they are reaching back into a past that they're nostalgic for. But the Homestead Act is also the law that led to the robbery of millions of acres of lands from Indigenous people passed over to non-native hands. So how might we more critically look at these contemporary manifestations of white supremacy here, ranging from far-right, neo-Nazi, neo-Confederate, alt-right organizers that have militias in the hills of Western Washington and have been prominent, unfortunately, on the streets of many places in Western Washington over the past few years? How do we understand the anti-immigrant and anti-Latino sentiments that often manifest in this region as connected to the anti-immigrant violence that defined the turn of the 20th century here? How might we see the ways that control and access to water and land is still a point of contention between Native and non-Native people in this region, and that many non-Native people are organizing in order to weaken the power of tribes? And of course, right, we can see that throughout this region, as economic growth continues for some people in some sectors, that also means displacement for a lot of Black and Indigenous people, especially in Seattle most prominently, but not exclusively there. And it's something we want to think about connected to a number of other crises that we are experiencing. Which brings us to how the past is very much present. So these are just two indices to think about: incarceration and homelessness, right? And what we see is that if we look at, for example, Whatcom County on top and thinking about incarceration, we can see that Black and Indigenous people are incarcerated at a much, much higher rate than white people. Okay, that is not because people of color are more inclined to crime. It is because we have a racist white supremacist system. Similarly, we can see that in this area, there are a lot of Indigenous people who are homeless in their own native land, and that those same racial inequalities that we can track with incarceration, with health outcomes, with income, also are manifesting in this homelessness crisis that we're experiencing. And so that brings us to our conclusion, right? And as I said, we are only able to get to the tip of the iceberg and scratch the surface here. But there's so much more to learn about the history of this place and how that past is present. I encourage you to think about ways that you might apply this history in your own community, in the work that you do at the institutions you belong to, and to keep digging and to keep learning. If you have any questions or want to learn more about this, I am more than happy to talk, so please reach out. Thank you for paying attention, for being part of this today, and I hope that you learned something. Again, feel free to reach out to me at joshua.ceretti@ww.edu if you have any questions.
All right. I'm just going to get back where I can see you all and hopefully take a look at some of these comments in the chat box. You know, in watching Josh's video, Dr. Ceretti's video, I just couldn't help to think to myself that it's so easy to live in this beautiful part of the country and, you know, wonder why it's so predominantly white and think, oh, it just happened that way. You know, this was by chance. But I think Dr. Ceretti's talk is a really important reminder that this didn't just happen. This change was implemented over centuries via the intentional exclusion and policies of removal of Indigenous people and persons of color. And this has a real impact on health outcomes today and the experiences of our friends and colleagues and community members of color today. So let's see if I can get over to this chat. Dr. Ceretti did really want to emphasize that he was happy to take questions if anyone had additional follow-up questions. All right. And it looks like Dr. Wu posted a link to the Chuckanut Health Foundation with suggestions of how to get involved in improving racial equity in our community. That's wonderful. Yeah, Ariel, that was new to me as well, learning that prior to King County being named after Dr. King, it was named after someone else who was, you know, an active segregationist. Okay, well, I'd like to transition us forward now and to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Paul Homer. Dr. Homer is a pediatric hospitalist at Peace Health. He graduated from the University of Nebraska Medical Center and completed his residency at Seattle Children's Hospital, serving as chief resident down there. He has a passion for human equity, for health equity and health justice. And he continues participation in the Seattle Healthcare Alliance Against Human Sex Trafficking. He has special interests in anti-racism in medicine and decreasing provider implicit bias in the clinical setting. In 2019, he was awarded the Family Choice Award for Family-Centered Care Resident by Seattle Children's Family Advisory Council for his support, respect, and partnership with his patients and families. He's a board-certified physician by the American Board of Pediatrics. He's married with 3 kids, including a 7-week-old at home, and he still managed to find time to join us today for this talk. And in his free time, he enjoys hiking, camping, bicycling, golfing, fishing, and cheering for the Huskies. Dr. Homer, it's all you.
Thanks, Erica, for that awesome introduction. Let me get my screen up here. All right, can everybody see that? Everybody can see that part?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I invited the Clowers over to share that dessert with us tonight. Does that sound fun?
Yes, yes, yes. This game is really fun.
What are you doing? Can I see?
Well, right now I'm watching ads, but
Okay. All right, here we go. This is my talk, the Curb Your Racism and How to Address Our Unconscious Bias. I have no financial disclosures, and I just want to give a quick thank you to Erica, Ariel, and Rachel for putting this together and getting these speakers together. Learned a lot already this morning. And thank you to Devyn Nixon, who helped inform the aspects of the conference as well. When you see, to try to get some chat involvement in, if you see a cloud like this, then I'm just asking that you type in the chat with any question that comes up here, and we'll try to have some back and forth here. At the end of this talk, I want you all to be able to highlight the healthcare providers that we all wish we could be, and define racial implicit and explicit bias, understand how and why it is formed, understand implicit bias role in institutional racism, and create a plan to expose that implicit bias on the day-to-day basis from patient to patient, and transform our hearts to become the providers we wish to be. So first, let's just make a list. If you can type in the chat, or you can write it down next to you if you have a piece of paper, make a list of the healthcare providers that we would hope to be, and how our patients and the families we treat would describe us. Yeah, kind, welcoming, respectful, compassionate, generous with time too, thoughtful and thorough, competent, empathetic, loving and fierce advocate. Yeah, all good things that are rolling through there. Something to highlight. This is just my list that I came up with, which many of you are also saying and putting through there. And honestly, this talk, this is what we're working towards, right? And that's what I want to talk about. And if that's not your desire, then none of this honestly will resonate with you, and it's not going to work. So let us do this together, and we can challenge each other and walk alongside to become all those things that we have labeled in the chat box. I want to start with this quote too. Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time, the arena, and the manner of our revolution, but more usually we must do battle where we are standing. And our patients do not get to choose who they get to see of us when they come in to access healthcare, especially in the emergency department in the hospital. And nor do we get to choose or direct the feelings and actions when patients and their families walk through our doors asking for help. And really, of all that, there's only one area we can control, and that's how we react to the patients. I do want to also acknowledge that during this COVID-19 pandemic, it's been mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausting in many different ways for all of us. And as Erica discussed, we've had a racial reckoning, and that's affected us all in different ways. Some that we have finally acknowledged, something that's already been happening, and some that's been an exposure of a dark area of our own hearts. Today's talk is going to be bias, racism, and provider outcomes. And as Dr. Wu talked about, there are many other isms that won't be talked about, that not to say that they aren't just as important. But I do ask you, despite this mentally and physically, emotionally exhausting time, that you sit in the discomfort and the reality that will be presented today. So I'm going to start with a brief story on where this became highlighted for me. While I'm talking about this, though, I asked on your paper, not in the chat, but on your own paper or in your mind, write down a specific interaction where you labeled a patient difficult. Mine was a 9-year-old girl, a Black girl with nephrotic syndrome. She was coming in from pain and swelling, and she was labeled by the person signing her out to me as non-compliant. Her family was aggressive and they didn't care. And that was because they didn't regularly take her give her medication. So she was billed to me as only being in a pain crisis. However, when I went to the emergency department, she had spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, which is the #1 killer of kids with nephrotic syndrome. Later on, when I was questioned by the mother while we were poking her child, that was her words, to get an IV and labs and to start antibiotics, I only told her what was going to happen, never asking what she knew about the diagnosis or why we were doing it. And never addressing any of the concerns or fears that she had. It was my plan that was only discussed. This encounter became one that was paternalistic and authoritarian. And later the next day, the family ended up leaving AMA. So I like to use this case as we build on unconscious bias, where mine may have come from and where I could have applied some techniques to help. So briefly, just so we all know what we're talking about, many of us have heard of implicit bias and unconscious bias. But I just want to highlight the definitions quick. Many of the examples and definitions I'll use from this book, The Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People by Dr. Banaji and Greenwald. So first we talk of an explicit bias. Our attitudes are beliefs that are known to the individual and will be and can be readily expressed by self-report. The implicit biases are unconscious. Our attitudes or beliefs that are not readily apparent to the individual and can differ markedly from a person's explicit and expressed beliefs. So one way they talk about how this affects our behavior, in the book, they have this page. And if I were to give you this page and tell you to look at the cross in the middle and slowly move the paper towards your eyes, eventually you would hit the blind spot in the macula of your eye and the black dots would disappear. However, what our mind does is fills that spot in with what it thinks is supposed to be there. And it's that grid. You would see the grid where the black dots are, and our mind can do that. We also have voids in our thoughts all the time. And our mind fills in with the pattern that we think is supposed to be there. And this can guide our behavior automatically, unintentionally, and unconsciously. And so we had the implicit association test that was on the registration. So you may have taken it. However, if you didn't, it's something you can do consistently. And if you did, I would suggest taking it again at various times. This test is used to draw out that unconscious bias. When they used to give surveys in the 1930s, people were more willing to admit their biased thoughts towards specific groups of people. However, in the 2010s, people won't say that readily. And so they use the IATs. And the way these works are they put pictures of faces against harsh or pleasant words to compare them. The way I think of it, and they describe it as sorting a deck of cards. If I was to tell you to put diamonds and hearts together and spades and clubs, and you were to divide those up, you could do that quite quickly. How if I told you to put diamonds and clubs together and spades and hearts, you may even make mistakes and it would take you much slower because your mind does not associate those as quickly together. So in the same way, here's an example. If you have a white preference, or like I did on this IAT, when you were asked to put words like black or faces of black kids and the word angry, or white faces and the word smile together, it might have only taken you 10 milliseconds. However, if you were then asked to put black faces and the word smile together and white faces and the word angry together, you may have made mistakes, or it may have taken you longer to do it. And so what these IATs have been used for is to expose those negative perceptions and stereotypes. And they've also been associated with various things, as if you have a white preference, then you have reduced empathy towards patients of color, or lower quality of care, reduced time in the room, or just things to highlight that they've been used for to show. However, this IAT in the website and the book will tell you this is not diagnostic. However, is a marker of caution. The way they describe it is when you're driving and you have the rear view mirror and a car starts coming up on you in your car's blind spot, there's that yellow light that blinks there and says, there's something dangerous here. In that same way, this can be used to keep others. This doesn't show us that we're bad drivers. It's just to keep us and those around us safe. So let's talk a little bit about how this implicit bias is formed. If you can type in the chat, what maybe you think influences your implicit bias. Yeah, our parents, they teach us so many things. Our experiences, the media, school. Even lack of experiences, community. So it's natural for us to have these biases. These help our mind think and act quickly. Our biases are the preconceived thoughts we have about an individual or individuals. These are not the actions. So the way they describe them, they call them mind bugs. And they highlight some areas. One is perception, availability, heuristic, and our memory. So for our perception, it's how we perceive things versus how they really are. Which lens are we looking through and how our experiences influence that? So for example, many patients, we put intentions on their actions. We might say they aren't not attentive to their child. However, they may be more exhausted than we have expected them through childbirth. Or they must not care because they didn't show up for their appointment. However, there may have been transportation or work issues that were unaddressed. And the next would be the availability heuristic. And that's when we think something happens more often than it truly does, because it's right at the forefront of our mind. And so, for example, which kills more, abdominal cancer versus car accidents? And the answer would be abdominal cancer. However, people aren't posting on Twitter or Facebook, or they're not shows or things on TV or wherever you get your news inputs stating that. And the next is our memory, which is also used to remember things quickly as well. And it associates thoughts together. So one example from our memory is Washington University did a study where they gave people a list of words, things like maple, ant, fly, stem, and berry. And then they took that list away and gave them another list with a bunch of words on it and said, only circle the words that were on that first list. And 75% would circle insect, which, as you can see, those fit together with those words because our mind is an associative machine. So when we go back to our case, when I heard the words over the phone, non-compliant or resistant, and then I met this patient that are Black, what does my mind do? My head thought difficult, time-consuming, African-American, puts these words together, and it creates a picture and thoughts and feelings of who this person might be. And what are the results? Ends up being a poor outcome. I stray away from what my standard of care is, to address feelings, concerns, allow patients to ask questions, and really replicating the results of the studies that have been seen in the past. So here are some examples of mind bugs that I've received. I'll let you read through them. These I've heard from my mom, dad, uncle. I hear my in-laws repeat similar things such as this. And I highlight the words in bold because those bring up images of things, and we know who we're talking about when we make these comments. It may not be explicit. The thing is, none of these things are supported by evidence-based or statistics. Don't support any of these. And these are narratives that I've heard when I was younger, even into my medical school training. And so even it looks different because my partner and children were a Medicaid family, and these are the things that are said. And so all of these things that we talk about, this becomes that grid. This is the scaffolding that my mind uses to fill in those gaps. I work at Peace Health in the hospital, and I've been working here since July 2020. Here's some things that I have heard and collected. And one of these I've said myself. And these are the worldly things people tell us to take away from the human right in front of us. When we say these things, how does it change the way we act towards families and patients? Doesn't it give us a reason to treat people differently than what those goals that we all listed out were originally? And when we give people these identities, this can grant or deny resources. Resources like appropriate medical care, time with physicians, even referrals to specialists. Additionally, self-worth, positive expectations, even freedom of movement or sense of belonging. So I want to talk about how these implicit biases that we form in racism and how those two concepts perpetuate each other. This picture was from Seattle Children's Health Equity Rounds, which is from a paper from Jonathan Metzl talking about structural competency. And Dr. Ceretti really talked about this and hit on this. So we see this cycle of implicit bias and then structural racism. And so we see on the left here, this priming and associations, assumptions, which we get from whatever our sources were that we just talked about. And then our history and policies and practices that are also defined, which are informed by these assumptions. And then this creates inequitable outcomes and racial disparities that then also influence our implicit bias in the priming and association. And so when we think about our implicit bias, we're thinking about our thoughts. Then we need to also name the racism that happens when it occurs and what we said and what our hospitals and clinics end up doing to patients. On this next slide, I'm going to outline many of the harms and racism has caused in the racial disparities. I just want to give a quick reminder, and Mrs. Juarez reminded me of this in the beginning, that this is her family, her grandchildren, and these are our brothers and sisters. So this is the research, and it's not extensive. This is what I could pull up looking at PubMed and Google Scholar. But I'll just have you read through them. And in the hospital, we go by systems, so I put them that way for there. I just wanted to highlight that in the emergency department, providers in the emergency department were willing to state that children and families that were American Indian or Alaska Native were seen as more challenging and less compliant when the providers were asked that. And I would challenge you to see which areas that you all care for these patients. I also want to highlight the ACEs that on the HCM part, the adverse childhood experiences, which we know lead to hypertension, obesity, diabetes, etc. Those things that Dr. Wu highlighted earlier. This is racism against Black kids. The ones I underline are ones that we're looking at as a group. And so I ask you to reflect on what we just saw, on the graphs that we saw earlier, and the inequities that we just highlighted in a large list. And the data presented by Dr. Wu is not by accident. Dr. Ceretti outlined it too, of what has happened in the past that creates these as well. And when we look at this, it's divided by who receives resources, like time and money, education, or disparate law enforcement, disparate policies and enforcement, the forced assimilation of white culture deemed American. And so I have this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. But all our phrasing, race relations, race chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And so this is the reality of our healthcare. Our system's not immune from these harms that were found in other hospitals and other studies. As Dr. Ceretti outlined, our history sits with us today. And so when we think about this, it's not who is good versus bad. We can't say that person's racist and that person isn't when we're talking about white individuals, because I do not identify as a racist. And as an individual, racism is not part of my identity. However, the facts are there. When we see this outline, this is happening. There's harm occurring to our BIPOC patients. So racism has been a part of my narrative in my actions. And we have to understand that we have good intentions. We want to be those providers that we label. However, the impact hasn't landed that way many times. And so sometimes when we are believing we are doing the right thing, and then we're told we are not, then we may not believe it. And now we think we are the ones being attacked. And so I put this Robin DiAngelo quote from White Fragility here, that stopping our racist patterns must be more important than working to convince others we don't have them. As white people, we must flip our questioning back on ourselves and not put it on our patients. And so in the hospital, when we see harm happening, we call a safety stop because there's harm happening within our hospitals and clinics. Here we heal people, but we also do dangerous things. This is happening to children. However, and all children have outcomes that are bad, but we have a disproportionate harm happening to BIPOC patients. We see that this occurs throughout the country and we're not immune from it. So here's a start. This is one place to address the racism within ourselves that is occurring and how to transform our implicit bias to start there. But how can we change something we can't see and can't even think about sometimes, or we barely even knew it was happening? Before we dive into this, I just want to take a moment to think about a situation where there was a bias you held, any bias. If you'd like to share, type it in the box or just write it on your sheet if you'd rather not. And if many of you are reflecting on your own, that's good too. So one evidence-based way that has shown to at least help a little bit is called the prejudice habit breaking intervention, and they have 5 techniques. However, I want you to think of these as ways to expose our heart posture when talking with, evaluating, and making treatment plans with families. The first one's perspective taking. Next, pursuing egalitarian goals, counter stereotyping, identifying common identities, and individuating. The first is perspective taking. And really that's imagine and appreciate the difficult situation faced by a stigmatized group, individual or group. So how do we take perspective? It's not the job of BIPOC providers or friends to really educate us. There are many resources available online, Netflix, Hulu, all of those. And if they do give us that opportunity to learn, please accept it with grace and consider it as a community service to us. And then listen, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Leave the anger straggling behind. That anger does not produce the providers that we want to be. And part of this perspective is not only the perspective of BIPOC patients and families, but also the perspective of what it means to be white in various spaces. The next is pursuing egalitarian goals. Egalitarian, meaning the relating to or believing in the principle that every person should have equal rights and opportunities. And then the goal is really, the way I like to think of it, is the discrepancy between a desired end state and one's current standing. And so stereotypes really are goals to recognize our environment and predict behaviors. And so what they showed is when you set a goal, the goal setting was activated in interactions with patients of a different race. And that stereotype activation that we have in the past decreased when we had these goals. So here's an example of one that I've had since starting in July. Any limited English proficient patient, you talk to their family twice per day with an interpreter. And like any goal, it needs to be realistic, attainable, and measurable. And you got to write it down and live it. And there will be times you do not reach this goal. However, writing it is the important part, and then it will come into effect. Next is counter stereotyping. And really, this is just rewriting in our minds the things that you think and the way that you see them. And so the words that we say, even subtly, will guide our thoughts, as we talked about before. So research and learn when you need to and where you need to. For example, I was in middle school when 9/11 hit. And so the anti-Islam and anti-Muslim narrative was very strong in my brain. And so now I follow a Muslim man on Twitter. He's also a dad. I use many of his terrible jokes that he tells as well. And that's how I rewrite that. And I constantly, when I see people on the street, I do that, rewriting that, thinking, man, I bet that guy has just really bad dad jokes and loves his kids. And so we also have to question the media and movies and the portrayals that are made out there. For example, The Blind Spot, the movie, the football movie, they said he scores highly in protective instinct of a football player. That's not even a real thing. However, it lives to this animalistic behavior that it tries to describe of people. And so these effects on our implicit bias, it found that even just having an image of somebody, even pictures they showed in a hallway or in your room, can decrease implicit bias associations. The next is identifying common identities. And really this is being personable. Again, many of these might seem easy. They do take our time and our effort. So this is sort of the in-group and out-group. Who do we say is one of us versus one of them? The research has shown that even a small attribute can put somebody that makes us feel as though they're in an in-group. And when we think that somebody's in our in-group or part of us, they did functional MRI studies showing that when we think somebody's part of us, that brain, when we're thinking about ourselves, that part of our brain lights up. However, when we're thinking them as different, our brains light up in a different area. And so this will guide our actions. All these effects, when we do this, it decreases provider anxiety. It shows that providers are more willing to be forgiving of behaviors. And really, this is family-centered care. As Barbara Juarez said, like, this is her grandchildren. These are our brothers and sisters. These are our family as well. I think Dr. Wu's daughter highlighted this too. I wrote this down, that the fundamental unit of justice is relationship. So the next was individuating, and this is using objective data to support our conclusions of a diagnosis. One example I can think of is a nurse called me and said of a lummy patient and the mom and the baby, and she said, man, that room is chaotic. And so I thought about it a second and I said, okay, what are you seeing that makes it chaotic? And it was just the fact that the mom had ADD and ADHD, and so she would be from one topic to another, but it wasn't anything more than that. And she was taking great care of her child. So we could see how this narrative can take off. However, there are limitations to using objective data, again, because our biases can play parts in it. So I want to emphasize that these techniques are evidence-based in some ways, but these are just the beginning. Because after training and educating this after 3 months, there was increased awareness of personal bias, lower IAT scores, decreased implicit bias, increased knowledge of race-related issues, and heightened concern. But these help, as we have seen, that implicit bias training, which this is not, but any implicit bias training, they have short-term effects because these are behavior modifications. And when these behavior modifications don't work or we're not using them, then they're not going to be shown and it'll go away, because we truly must have a change of heart in all of this. So I think we know that implicit bias is prevalent. We know it's harming people. And we live and work in a system that's racist. I think we don't have a choice but to live and work in it as well. Eula Biss highlighted this. We were born on this team, but we don't have to play by its rules. We have our techniques to start, and you will make mistakes going forward, and you will be called out by others. Again, we have good intentions and we want to do good. We want to be those providers that we said we do. And so we have to move towards working on this. I just have an example of what it might look like because this is what it looked like for me. First, you got to reflect on all the things we've heard from Dr. Wu, from Dr. Ceretti, from the things you'll hear next. And then for me, it was going back to the gospel and repenting. And you have to forgive yourself because what you will find is that you have harmed and you will do it again. And you have to forgive yourself that. Relearn the history and then make a plan. Running through these techniques, evaluate your own story and seek out a story, write a goal, practice the counter stereotyping, connect with every patient and family, and ask questions when things feel racist or unright. And then recognize and apologize. When I talk to any of my colleagues of color, it's not lost on them that this is happening or that you could have racism within you. When it happens, recognize and apologize that. And you don't need to explain, just apologize. Here are the resources that will be highlighted. If you want the resources of harms from Native children, I'll have those on request. And then here's some just perspective taking on the go. Oh, oops. I got rid of that perspective taking on the go too quickly, so nobody could write anything down.
All right, well, Paul, thank you so much for that talk. One of the things I really appreciated about what you just described was, no matter where someone is on the spectrum, whether they're learning about implicit bias for the first time, whether they've heard about it and taken 6 different IAT tests and now working on making goals now, whether they are working on making goals and improving those goals and making mistakes and then making more goals, there's room for all of us to take that information and try and apply it to our daily lives, and acknowledging that we're all going to make mistakes with this, but part of the work, and I'll say this, part of our work as a white person is to say, I'm willing to take the energy and time to try and improve how I'm acting and to learn about implicit bias, to know that this is a normal and common thing that we all have, and that by learning about those biases, we can provide even better care for our patients, which I know is what is at the forefront of all of our minds. So with that, it's about 9:35 right now. We are going to take a coffee break. Please come back at 9:45. And we'll jump back into things. I'm just going to put up the link again for the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship. We'll hopefully have an update for you guys about how much we have raised so far after the break. And thank you so much for your attention. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to go ahead and get started again. First of all, I'd like to thank you, those of you guys who have donated to the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship during the break. I think all of us who are here in healthcare would not be present in our positions today without the support and mentorship along the way with folks who believed in us. And now is the chance that we can help pay that forward to help support BIPOC individuals in our community in becoming an active part of our healthcare team. With that, we have an announcement about two very exciting contributions from our community partners. So I'd like to turn it over briefly to Dr. Sudhakar Karlapudi with Peace Health and to Heather Flaherty with the Chuckanut Health Foundation. Dr. Karlapudi, would you like to start?
Happy to. Can you guys hear me? Good morning, everybody. Wow, the last 2 hours have been a learning experience. So thank you for putting this together, and thank you for our speakers. It's just amazing to be on listening to you. I am here today on behalf of Peace Health to share with you that we are honored to commit $25,000 to the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship. We believe with optimistic hope that 10 years from now, when we are gathered in a conference, hopefully not virtually, the youth who have received these scholarships would be with us and would be leading us and championing this important work. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karlapudi. That is so exciting, and we are so appreciative. I'd now like to turn it over to Heather Flaherty.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Heather Flaherty. I'm the Executive Director of the Chuckanut Health Foundation, and I'm really excited to announce that Chuckanut is also pledging $25,000 to seed this scholarship. And we're really grateful to do this in partnership with all of you. This is a momentous opportunity as a community to get in on the ground floor of helping ensure there's representation in our healthcare system. So thank you to each of you for your contributions already. And our goal is to raise $150,000 so that we can continue to give in perpetuity forever and ever, that this will be a priority because we know representation matters and it makes a difference. So thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much, Heather. That is so exciting. What a wonderful way to start a weekend. So at this point, we're going to transition to Devyn Nixon. In planning this conference, we wanted to hear from some videos of local BIPOC providers and patients about their experiences in our community. Given time and COVID restraints, we were fortunate to work with Monica Kohler of Connecting Community Bellingham. She is a digital storytelling facilitator, and she helps folks create these beautiful videos. She worked with a group of providers to help them share their stories. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Devyn Nixon. Devyn Nixon is an ARNP, a cardiology and family nurse practitioner at Skagit Regional Health. She received her ARNP from Gonzaga University and is board certified by the American Academy of Nurse Practitioners. She also serves as the VP of the Mount Baker Nurse Practitioners Association and serves on the Mount Baker Planned Parenthood Board and guest lectures at the Western Washington University Nursing Program. She's a member of the praise and worship team at her church, and originally from Capitol Heights, Maryland, she came to the Pacific Northwest because of her dad's military service, and we're so lucky that she stayed. Devyn, passing it off to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome back. I'm a nurse practitioner at Skagit Regional Health. I have no financial disclosures or conflicting relationships to report. One of the traditions in African American culture at the opening of a formal gathering is ancestral and elder reverence. You've seen this evidence in the too many hashtags trending, calling on us to say their names. Today, I pay homage to my enslaved ancestors whose forced investments into the economy of this nation, they nor their descendants have ever been compensated for. An investment whose dividends sustain the lives of those who benefit from white supremacy. When I was first invited to contribute to this conference, we discussed including patient experiences as part of our digital storytelling. My mother was one of the patients considered. She was excited at the thought of sharing her health journey as a Black woman who grew up in segregation, who accessed military medicine as a veteran and dependent wife, and who had signs and symptoms of heart failure in her 40s. She was eventually accurately diagnosed and lovingly cared for at Skagit Regional Health, the University of Washington, and CMAR, Mount Vernon. My mother, Gail Rainey Barron, passed away peacefully, surrounded by family on February 8th of this year. As I give honor to my first ancestor, I invite you, right where you are, to consider your own elders and ancestors, to honor them, saying their names together, and we say Ashe. Let's take a couple of seconds to honor those who've helped shape us and who've gone before us by closing our eyes and saying their names. Ashe. This is a CME event, an educational conference. The way we describe education is a westernized concept itself. For the next several minutes, we will take pause from the cognitive look at racism in medicine and bolster our emotional intelligence. For centuries, BIPOC people have been dehumanized in this country, which naturally seeps into the fabric of every aspect of our lives. Through the storytelling process, my colleagues and I humanized ourselves. We spoke of things we are rarely given the time and space to speak of. We encountered themes of being seen as workhorses, some of us being called on to participate in DEI committees and to speak at events because of the diversity our skin represents, but while failing to be acknowledged in other ways. We encountered themes of being put upon to bear the weight of highly charged topics, sometimes without compensation or provision for restorative self-care. The overarching theme, though, was loneliness. This experience was healing because when we were together, we were not alone. When you work in a place where you're the only one, especially if there's a homogeneous majority, the majority can feel like the default or the norm. That's something else, making yourself feel abnormal. The pressure to assimilate, to code switch so as not to draw added attention to your already different existence results in a constant burying of our very soul. Through this process, we provided comfort and healing to one another. We hope our stories offer a kind of education that you won't find in peer-reviewed journals or in data-driven statistics. I've worked in healthcare for over 20 years, starting as a medical transcriptionist, retraining as a registered nurse, and continuing my education to become a family and cardiovascular nurse practitioner. I enjoy singing, reading, spending time with my family and my dogs. Dr. Emmanuel Eusebio has cared for children in the Pacific Northwest for over 2 decades. He's also participated in volunteer projects in South America and the South Pacific. When he isn't practicing medicine, he and his wife are active in their parish and community. They love to sail, fish, hike with their dogs, cheer on the Seattle Sounders, and explore different cultures and cuisines. They have 3 adult children. Dr. Eusebio is a longtime Catholic Youth Organization soccer coach and volunteer with the Boy Scouts of America. Kusamat Shirley Williams, RN, is a member and resident of the federally reserved lands of the Lummi Nation. Her lineage originally comes from the ancestral homelands of the saltwater salmon people, what is now known as the Salish Sea. She and her partner, Suhunep Hushmin Troy Olson, and together they have 3 children and 2 beautiful grandchildren. She enjoys learning about who she is, where she comes from, and helping others do the same. Shirley is passionate about Indigenous public health and addressing root causes of trauma for Indigenous peoples and nature. She envisions her medical office is the Salish Sea, for without Mother Earth, we do not have our health. Visit whiteswanenvironmental.org to learn more about her work. Dr. Chow-Ying Wu grew up in Connecticut, Japan, and Missouri. As the youngest of 4 children, he attended the University of Washington, where he did pre-med, medical school, and residency in family medicine. After residency, Dr. Wu joined the Public Health Service and worked on the Navajo Reservation in Shiprock, New Mexico. Dr. Wu says without reservation that the team at North Sound Family Medicine and the Family Care Network are the best yet. We'd like to thank you for attending today. We know this conference is not mandatory, and it means a lot to us that you are here. We would like to extend a special thank you to Monica Kohler with Connecting Community, who guided us through this process. We're often asked, where are we from? We invite you to hold space for our answers to that question. Ours are stories of lineage, of immigration, of time immemorial, and of place. These are our stories. Thank you for listening.
I am from Prince George's County, Maryland, by way of the motherland and ships. Yarba, Mende, Mandinka, Bantu. I am from the children of the Harlem Renaissance, Black. I am a child of the Civil Rights Movement, soundtrack by Motown, Negro. I am from collard greens and black-eyed peas, from cornbread and tomato soup, African American. I am from singing hymns, saying prayers, and let us stand for the reading of the word, Baptist. I am from lives cut short by segregation, medical apartheid, kidney failure and heart failure, hypertensive. I am from strong men whose lives mattered and still matter, daughter, sister, wife. I am from smart women, protective, hopeful, warm, loving. I am from Don't Forget You're Black and Be Excellent. I am a young matriarch whose heart holds the lineage and whose hands never had a choice but to work. I am from denied history and undeniable worth.
I am from the islands, far across the sea, filled with smiling faces and gentle winds. I am from Seattle, forests of vibrant green and oceans blue, beautiful and invigorating, yet struggling with an uncertain future. I am of the Philippines, tranquil Pacific waves, and exotic tropical aromas. Isolated and misunderstood. I am of the church, of prayer, of family and community. Traditions of resilience, reconciliation, and hope. I am from progressiveness, suddenly slapped by racial profiling. Confused by popularity charts couched as performance metrics, wondering, how do these adjust for implicit bias? Eyes freshly seared by images of George Floyd and Asian hatred. Blamed for a virus we did not create. Now battling concurrent pandemics, one viral and modern, one moral and ageless. I am of gratitude and anguish, confusion and resilience. Confronting complacency, resolute in my commitment to move forward, eyes open. Seeking clarity. Unapologetically speaking the truths I see, while striving for justice and praying for mercy.
Walking in the park, long after dark, taking in the sights of the city. Look around, Eliza. They are trying to do the unimaginable. There are moments that the words don't reach. There's a grace too powerful to name. We push away what we can never understand. We push away the unimaginable. They are standing in the garden.
I am from Medicine People. I am from Elanganuk, the ancestral homelands of the saltwater salmon people. From the place where the Creator threw the stones and created the islands for our people. From the place where the Creator threw the stones and our people returned to the ancestral homelands. Learning from the homeland, that is my favorite childhood place. Past, present, future. I am from the beginning of time, where there is the color of peace and renewal, and the end of time, where there is the color of sacrifice, sorrow, and suffering. Going full circle to the dimensions of physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional, I wipe my tears, clear my ears, clear my throat, my heart, my hands, my feet. I straighten my homelands, restore my good mind, and be fair to all people, for place is where health begins. I am from a physical world of cultural, spiritual genocide, marginalization, ethnic erasure, and historical trauma from bystander effect. I am from the blood of the millions forgotten in the name of discovering the Americas, and from the acquired power of those who state they do not understand Indigenous public health. I am from generations placed within borders, within borders, within borders. Be invisible, be silent, appease. I am what CNN calls something else. I'm from the spiritual world of the Swan clan, Chief Seattle, House of the Seven Brothers, Weach, Sihom, Lord Jim Bulge, House of Discanum. I'm from a family that remembers our sacred gifts and responsibilities. from Kusamat and Sali Etseshwala, the spirit of the reef net, the teardrop of the mountain. I'm from the lineage of elders who have told me since I was a child, remember who you are and where you come from, and to believe with male and female balance, we have direct connection to the Creator, and there is magic in your word. I am from the deep, dark secret of a government who used religion to kill the Indian and save the man. I am from truth and healing. I am from resilience. I am from
Hi guys, this is Erica. We may be having a pause technology-wise. So while we are seeing if it'll restart, I'm going to try and get our backup video going from my screen. Just bear with me just a moment. Bear with me, we're so close. Devyn, could you let me know exactly what point in the video we're at for our time? And I'm working on the screen share right now. We'll get this up and going.
So I do not have the exact time, but I believe Tiffany has that, and Tiffany should be able to let you know the exact time. And thank you to all of you for bearing with us. This was an incredible process and a way of sharing ourselves with you that we don't typically get to. So please sit tight. There's more to come. Thank you.
I am from truth and healing. I am from resilience. I am from medicine people. I'm from the sacred birthplace of Mother Earth, and I'm from the DNA of the saltwater salmon people. And our food is our medicine. It is sacred. It is our wealth, and it is our health. I am from the red paint, a lineage of medicine men and medicine women, spiritual workers, since time immemorial. And in this moment, I invite you to hold the sacred space and energy of our ancestor, Mother Earth. So together, we can transform the logic, culture, and epistasis of a modern world system that brought us to this global health crisis. Release the illusion and share in the magic of our word.
I am from the woods of Connecticut, days of maple tree climbing and running in the wet grass, nights of mosquito bites and stars, and overnight, perennially soaked sneakers almost dried by the furnace. I am from the magic of spellbinding stories told over long evenings and nights of legendary food. I am from Chinese immigrants, cut off from homeland and extended family by revolution, and so a small family, a family apart and close, hot-tempered but guarded, empathic and yet reserved. I am from a family of joyful, curious, wandering scholars, and yet these hands have become hands of work in a community that has become home. These hands have held newborn babies and lifted the dead, have felt first and last breaths, framing all of us between. Spread into water and into air, to feel the flow change so slightly and yet so definitively as spirits enter and depart. These hands have pounded keyboard, mouse, touchpad, left click, and right click that stand between me and my patient's eyes. And these hands have held their hands when there was nothing else left to do. These hands have worked beside friends in so many moments, emergent and mundane, history accumulating as deep and variably as Shuxon snow. And in some of those moments, when these hands have injured, when my eyes have not seen, when my words and actions have harmed, when I have been racist, these friends have helped me see so much that I don't yet understand.
All right. Thank you to Devyn, to Monica, to Ying and Shirley and Manny. Thank you for all of you guys for doing these videos. What a beautiful compilation and what beautiful stories. You know, I just want to take a minute and pause because those are a lot of really evocative images. And I think that was such a nice way to highlight the beautiful history and perspective that each of you guys bring to our healthcare community. So thank you for taking care of patients in our community, and thank you for taking the time to make those stories. Next, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Glenn Garrow. Dr. Glenn Garrow is a board-certified internal medicine physician with a special interest in geriatric health. He works at Peace Health, and he previously worked at the Vancouver Clinic in Vancouver, Washington, and at the Skagit Valley Medical Center at Stanwood Camino. He is of Filipino descent, but was born and raised in Hawaii. And in his spare time, he enjoys spending time with family, playing basketball, and shellfishing. And today, he'll be speaking for a few minutes about a relatively new group in our community called the Provider of Color Affinity Group. It's all you, Manny. I'm sorry, it's all you, Dr. Garrow.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me fine? Perfect. So as Erica had mentioned, I was born in Hawaii and born and raised there of Filipino descent. And it's actually a rarity to have Filipino physicians in Whatcom County and the surrounding counties here. And oftentimes when Filipino patients have met me or had seen me as I was covering for other physicians, they oftentimes would want to establish with me as their primary care provider. I am a product of a program that was to increase, the goal was to increase diversity in medicine. I did not get into medical school right away. It took me 2 tries. And on the second try, I actually concurrently applied for a post-baccalaureate program through the University of Hawaii's John A. Burns School of Medicine, called Iniho'ola, which is a post-baccalaureate program, intensified program for 1 year, where the goal was to study sciences and humanities, discussing cultural practices in medicine, particularly the Native Hawaiian practices. And upon completion of this program, we became students in the School of Medicine the following year. So the goal was to increase diversity in medicine. And I want to talk about some of the medical literature research that I was able to find that has shown that having a concordant relationship where you are the same race as your patients has improved quality of care in medicine. In 2019, the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities did a survey from 2014 to 2015 that showed statistical significance across the board in Latinos, Blacks, and Asians when their clinician was of the same race. In the Journal of Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, there was a comparison in Black and white newborns, and the mortality of Black newborns decreased by half when their physician was Black. And this was manifested strongly in complicated cases such as preeclampsia. And so the conclusion from this was that physicians of a social group are more likely to be aware of the challenges and issues of their same group. In 2013, the Journal of Patient Education and Counseling studied a small group of Latinos looking into the mental health field. And when there was concordance of being the same race, there was increase in bonding and increase in continuity of care in the Latino population in the study. More recently in JAMA from November, there was 117,000 Press Ganey surveys evaluated from 2014 to 2017 in an urban academic setting. And when there was racial discordance with physician and patient relationships, there was a lower likelihood of getting a maximum score. And this was seen especially in Black and Asians who received the lowest score. One measure to retain and hopefully increase diversity in the medical field, especially in Whatcom, Skagit, Island, and San Juan counties, is this program that, or this group that I co-founded called the Providers of Color Affinity Group, which was actually a vision started by my wife, who was involved with a similar program over at Western Washington University. And this program was also co-founded by Dr. Kim Koyamatsu, who's present today. And our goal and mission is to support healthcare providers of diverse backgrounds, build a more inclusive healthcare environment locally, advance the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Whatcom, Skagit, Island, and San Juan counties, provide a safe space for providers of color to build community and engage socially, and to advocate for providers of color and provide support and resources. And our goal is to have quarterly education for providers of color and our white allies on diversity, and to promote and support professional careers in medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Garrow, for taking the time to join us today. I think we can all agree that there are tremendous benefits to our community and to our patients when we diversify our workforce, and when we have a healthcare provider population and a healthcare team population that represents the beautiful diversity in our patients in our community. So I really appreciate the fact that you have taken the lead in creating this POCAG group. And I'd also like to acknowledge that in the creation of the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship, we really relied on the guidance and insight of the POCAG group to help us make sure we were focusing on the right things and had the right ideas in mind. So we really appreciate your help, Kim's help, the POCAB group's insight in guiding us in the creation of that scholarship. And I'm very excited to see where it goes. At this point, one, if you haven't donated yet, I've got an exciting update. We have so far, thanks to the contributions of Peace Health and Chuckanut Health Foundation, and all of you who have donated, raised $63,000 for the scholarship, which is amazing. That's so fantastic. And so with that good news, I'd like to translate to another, or transfer towards another step in thinking about what we can do in the future, and introduce 3 individuals who will be discussing strategies for recruiting and retaining BIPOC providers and staff in our healthcare workforce. First of all, Lewis Williams. Welcome. Lewis Williams is the VP of Talent Acquisition at Peace Health. He has over 20 years of experience in this field and specializes in finance, healthcare, technology, and diversity, equity, and inclusion recruitment strategies. He has led the initial executive diversity recruitment efforts for Bank One, now JP Morgan Chase. And previously, he also has worked with Ochsner Health of New Orleans, Honor Health of Phoenix, and Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady Health System of Baton Rouge. With him, Mr. Lewis Williams will be accompanied today by Mr. Nathan William and Mr. Brett Crane. Nathan Stanley and Brett Crane. Nathan Stanley is a diversity and inclusion recruiter with Peace Health, and Brett Crane is the System Director of Physician and Provider Recruitment at Peace Health. Mr. Williams, take it away.
Thank you so much, Erica. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I just want to thank everyone involved for the invitation, the organizers, all the effort, and the contributions of all the presenters. It's really been fantastic, and I'm really excited to be a part of this event. So I want to start with, I'm Lewis Williams, Vice President of Talent Acquisition here at Peace Health, and I have no financial disclosures to make. I want to tell you a little bit about my background to kind of expand on where Erica began. So I was originally from Atlanta, Georgia, grew up in Auburn, Alabama, which is a university town, not unlike Bellingham or Eugene. And, you know, my descent is, I'm clearly African-American, but within that, many of us African-Americans are essentially multiracial. You know, there is some European heritage in my background, and there is certainly some Native American heritage in my background as well, and clearly also some African heritage. So it is part of the American experience of being essentially Black, right? So, and from the Southeast, which is very interested in moving all around the country. So like I said, I was born in Atlanta, grew up in Auburn, Alabama. I went to school at Tulane University in New Orleans and got my bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies. Within that Latin American Studies, I specialized in African diaspora, essentially the study of Africans moving and spreading throughout the Americas. Very interesting foundational historical and anthropological background. And so it really changed my perspective from leaving high school. A lot of what we're talking about today is sort of deconstructing and deprogramming education or lack thereof about what was truly history in the world. So I graduated from Tulane, also achieved an MBA in finance from Auburn University and moved to Chicago, Los Angeles, and back to New Orleans, and then now here to Vancouver, Washington. So I've been around the country and seen quite a few different environments, and this is interesting here in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to talk a little bit about what we are trying to do at Peace Health as an organization in this community. And we have a very strong heritage of social justice, and we in this moment of racial tension and reckoning and discovery, are doubling down our efforts to become an anti-racist organization, which is a form of awareness that I believe is proactive in its nature to overcoming many of the systemic issues we discussed today. So, you know, we're on this journey to deconstruct, you know, some of this bad history, as well as understand our part in that construct and community, and then take actions to proactively influence for the better in the future. So I'm going to share my screen here if I can. Pick the right one. I didn't share for you guys yet, but we'll get it there. Sorry, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen here. Okay, let me know if this is the correct screen. Can you guys see my opening?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Perfect. So, you know, I want to introduce Brett Crane, who's my System Director of Provider Recruitment. He'll be joining me today, and Nathan Stanley as well. And I'll be tossing it to them to get into some of the more specifics of how we're going about some of our activities. Pardon my, there we go. So this is my opening quote from James Baldwin. In discussing topics such as this, you can never go wrong than discovering some of the great thinkers and writers on this topic. And James Baldwin has a quote here: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And that is where I think we are in this moment. It's a long journey that we're on, and we're definitely swimming upstream and against history and against a lot of structural and systemic issues. I think of recruiting in terms of all the topics that were brought up and discussed today as essentially where the rubber meets the road and we begin to move into sort of tangible actions to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in a part of the country where it is, you know, lacking, so to speak. And there are many, many people of color in the area that we need to include in healthcare and include in our professional outreach. But for the most part, we also need to reach out across the nation and invite people to this area to begin to help us influence the mix, the culture, the inclusion, and proactively pronounce our welcome to them to join our organizations and to join us here in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm not sure where every attendee of this event is on their journey. I'm not sure how much of a recruiting team or staff or strategy or plan you have in your organizations. So if I'm off the mark, I really hope to participate in the question and answer session and get more specific around your particular cases or instances. But regardless of where you are and what size organization you're coming from, leadership support is crucial, and you'll need to assess your organization's history, resolve, culture, demographics to determine if your efforts are going to be your own, singular, or if you're going to have the support of your organization and the community around you to help you retain the people if you are able to, in fact, find and recruit them to the Pacific Northwest. Over to the right, I have just a general breakdown of the race and ethnicity of physicians in the United States as of 2018. And you can see a couple things, obviously a predominance of white physicians, but also if you look at the other side of the pie graph, there is a large number of what we would consider BIPOC physicians out there, and they're underrepresented in our areas. And so this is how we're planning to impact that. So what recruitment strategy do you have currently that exists outside of the DEI space? How do you normally attract physicians, nurses, pharmacists, administrators? You need to understand what those channels are and how they can be transformed to be part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. Again, not knowing where you're starting, but if you have a way of adding new people to your organization, figure out who that is, whose responsibility that is, and then begin to do your part to influence how they go about their selection, where they go to do their selecting, what strategies they may employ to discover both students, professionals, and mid-level professionals and providers to bring into your organization. All of a sudden, essentially since George Floyd's murder, the entire nation and many organizations have become quote unquote woke. Essentially what this means in the recruitment process is that every organization that has a recruitment wing or a DEI space and professionals in it are actively targeting the HBCUs and the BIPOC organizations where they can identify talent. So it is not an easy time to begin this effort. And it is not an easy time to differentiate your efforts, because previously a Spelman or a Morehouse or Tuskegee University may have had 200 organizations show up for career fair day. Well, now they have requests for over 1,000 organizations to show up for those same events. So it is not a great time to actually just be beginning, but there's no point in sitting on your hands. So what can you do in that context? So if we're talking about students, you want to find candidates where they live. And so we do have the HBCUs, but then we also have the majority schools. And what I mean by majority schools are schools like UW, University of Oregon, Portland State University, Auburn University, Tulane University, any organization, any college or secondary program that is not essentially an HBCU, falls into this category. Inside every major majority school, there are pockets of affinity groups and organizations, and certainly in every major, there are students that fall into the categories of BIPOC. And so what I propose, and part of our strategy here at Peace Health, is not really to fish in the exact same pond everyone else is trying to fish in, but to find a different pond and access talent in a different way that is often overlooked. So in these majority schools that are local schools that we have normal relationships with, and when we go to their career days and their events, we have the opportunity to identify diversity and diversity resources and students that we would like to invite into the organization as well. So that opportunity exists at medical schools, in pharmacy programs and educational majors and programs across the spectrum. So I encourage you to have kind of a dual approach Definitely within the HBCU space, it is not advised that you just generally attend HBCU events, but that you determine exactly which HBCUs develop and produce the type of professionals that you need to seed your organization with. So once you find that one or two specific HBCU partners, you want to invest in that organization, and they will be looking from larger employers of an investment to differentiate themselves. I've been on conferences and calls around this increase in traffic to HBCUs, where some of the career advisors say the two best ways to differentiate yourself, if you're now a new participant in this talent war, is there are two main forms, and both of them are financial. So one, your organization will probably need to make contributions or investments directly to the organization to have specific access to the types of students that you want to meet. I'm going to say types, I mean majors and professional development programs. So to get that special access, there will be an investment required. That amount would be something you'd have to negotiate and determine. But even once you are in front of these students and they are being pursued by organizations from all across the country, the real differentiator is your opening offer in terms of their salary. And so it was pretty frankly put to us in one of these conference calls that if you're going to be an unknown organization to a young Black or Hispanic student, and you're trying to convince them to join your organization versus an organization that their parents have heard of and know the name Coca-Cola or Pfizer or IBM, and you're trying to set yourself apart with a great opportunity for them. Part of the way to set yourself apart is the actual salary and dollars that you offer, because your parents will quickly forgive all of their investment and in that child's decision to not join the Fortune 100 company or the Fortune 200 company's development program if their offer is $50,000 a year starting salary and your offer is $75,000 a year starting salary. Because at the end of the day, as we've discussed, there are some historic economic disadvantages that these families have had to endure, and then to produce a child who makes it to college, they're literally looking for a payoff at the end of this investment, and that is the economic future for their child and their family. So they have to be, the students in this regard have to be pragmatic. And so if they're not going to go with the big name, they're going to be asked to move to another part of the country, then they're certainly that they're not familiar with, and they're certainly going to be looking for a little bit of a premium there. So that was one point I wanted to make. And then in terms of all the organizations that you reach out to, do your best to be very sincere, very targeted, and make a genuine and concerted effort. I think everyone on this call hopefully has the best of intentions and will certainly pursue real action and activities to build relationships, set achievable goals, and not be what we would call performative in terms of just doing a thing here or there or sending a recruiter to this and that place without any intention. And then I would like to jump ahead to the success. You've now found a candidate who you have successfully recruited, and I think many of the previous speakers spoke to. When you onboard this individual, and if they are the first, or if they are one of few within your organization, retaining them will require some proactive support, because they'll have to be supported within the organization. They'll have to find support groups external to their workplace organizations, but in your communities. And so anything you can do to help them develop these relationships would be beneficial to you and them. So do your best to help build real partnerships, real mentor-mentee relationships, real external relationships. And if you have the numbers, develop affinity groups so that they can build a sense of community within your organizations and help you retain these individuals that we will be trying to convince to stay here in the Pacific Northwest and help us diversify our cultures and add more flavor, mix of ethnicities, backgrounds, points of view, and add to the richness of our communities. And so my goal, which I am trying to influence to become Peace Health's goal, is for maximum diversity and maximum inclusion. And what I mean by that is simply, many times we are asked, well, what is our target? And the response the asker is looking for is a percentage, a number, a goal, absolute numbers. And to that I say, our goal is maximum diversity, maximum inclusion, because what ceiling should we put on our attempts to include people and diversify our organizations? So in my mind, maximum diversity is the goal, because if we get to 3% or 4% or 5% or whatever number matches the demographics of the communities and the patients that we serve, is that essentially the most we can do? And then we pat ourselves on the back and move on. And I think not. I think the goal is to become a beacon of diversity and inclusion within our communities, and to help others in the communities execute strategies as an employer to continue to support diversity, social justice, and inclusion within the communities and within our workforces. So I'm going to talk briefly around the actual strategy, targeting, research. So targeting is understanding who you're looking for. Research, you're going to Google and find websites of the majority professional organizations. Many have diversity sections on the website that you can begin to connect with the professionals who work there to understand and uncover pools of talent that you maybe have not intentionally targeted before. You need to research, find the affinity professional associations. They exist. There are associations for Hispanic, Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, nurse, physician, pharmacist, administrators, etc. But have you looked for them? Have your recruiters looked for them? Have they connected with those organizations and those affinity groups at a professional level to attend their conferences, to begin to build sincere relationships? Suppliers. There are many different types of suppliers you could diversify it with, but what I want to speak to here are search firms. In the talent acquisition space, if you would like to increase your diversity, start or consider starting with hiring a minority-owned search firm to help you execute those searches. They do exist, and they are quite good, and they have natural networks into many of these affinity groups and professional associations. So I'd encourage you to explore their capabilities as well. Students, as I said earlier, don't overlook your majority schools and their affinity clubs and organizations. They exist. There are plenty of smart students, BIPOC students at majority schools that are really overlooked by the normal and traditional recruitment for diversity, equity, and inclusion directly to the HBCUs. Handshake, if you're going to be recruiting in the student space, you're going to have to investigate Handshake. It is essentially the LinkedIn for students and students' connections to many major organizations. It is a great recruitment tool. And the challenge I put out is to try and transform your recruitment and internship opportunities to be entirely to focus on DE&I, because the majority already has many ways into our organizations, many ways into the companies that we work for. But these small programs where, you know, there may be 3 or 4 individuals that we bring on per year to participate, there's no reason not to refocus those to be entirely DEI focused, because their percentage is so small. And, you know, the effort that you're putting there, you can refocus it and say, this can be an impact, because now we're going to be bringing in 1 or 2 individuals of color to our organization each year. It really helps if you can make that shift. And then last, of course, find your best opportunity, build those sincere pipelines, and invest in that relationship, both financially if possible, but certainly through actions if you can. And I'll leave you with the list of links and web pages that'll just give you a good head start in discovering some of these organizations, figuring out, networking with them, finding the right contacts. This is the journey that Peace Health is on right now. You know, I would say in many ways we're at step 1. We are very much in the discovery phase, and in the middle of COVID, we're doing as much of this digitally as possible to make connections that we would otherwise have made in person. But we're prepared to do that. And, you know, we brought Nathan Stanley on to really focus our efforts here. And we are excited to one day unleash him out into the community. But right now he is, as we all are, pretty much doing this work virtually and, you know, doing the best he can to build the list for us to understand where he's going to spend his time when he is able, because he will be globetrotting, so to speak, across the country to a lot of these organizations. I apologize if I've ignored the chat, but this concludes sort of my part, and I'll turn it over to Brett to see if he has anything he would like to offer and share with our strategies, and then I would ask him, he'd turn it over to Nathan after him.
Thank you, Louis. An opportunity to speak to smart, interesting, engaging people. Sure, I'll take it. And I love in watching those of you whom have your videos on, like cats wandering across the camera, or a young daughter sitting next to you. Like that's fantastic. Just a fun to see you. Those of you whom have your cameras on. Louis spoke to specific strategies. I wanted to speak for a moment just about our orientation, like how we approach those strategies.
Almost, keep
going. Sorry, I didn't catch that. So how we approach them. First and foremost, with humility. I mean, I'd love to speak with you about how we're finding such fantastic success in recruiting diverse physicians and providers to Peace Health, but frankly, I couldn't speak with authority on that. If you'd asked me 3 years ago when I arrived here how well we do it, I probably wouldn't respond with appropriate humility. I'd say, well, we do a great job. In the aggregate, physician populations are inherently diverse here in the United States, largely because we don't produce enough of them. And so increasingly we rely upon foreign medical graduates or international medical graduates, which is an inherently diverse population. So in the aggregate, looks great. And that's how I would have answered. But when you kind of look beneath the hood, you find that we are finding that we're not doing marvelously at specific populations. And we would like to. And so we are approaching this renewed effort at increasing the diversity of our candidates, and then therefore our hires, from that basic place of humility. I have not mastered how to do this, but I'm very inclined to master it. So be humble is what we're trying to be. Also, to be deliberate. As Dr. Ceretti outlined, this kind of white space phenomenon in the Pacific Northwest, I feel he did a good job making clear, is largely the result of deliberate behavior. It's a deliberate outcome of our forebears. Why would we imagine that changing it wouldn't also need to be a deliberate and sustained effort? So be humble, be deliberate, be creative, flexible. Because we've not mastered this, identifying. Lewis had used the fishing analogy, and oftentimes I think of recruitment in terms of fishing, like making sure that we have hooks in the water where the fish we're after are at. And so where are they? So not just the HBCUs, affinity groups, societies, organizations. There isn't a clear-cut, hyper-defined formula for success in this. And so we kind of learn as we go. And so being willing to be flexible and creative and discovering what's working and what may work, be willing to take chances, turn over every rock that you can, with the knowledge that Lewis also alluded to earlier, that like there's a lot of folks doing this right now. So how do we distinguish ourselves from other organizations that are engaged in kind of similar behavior? How do we increase the diversity, equity, and inclusion of our organization? And then finally, so we're trying to be humble, deliberate, creative, and flexible, but also collaborative. So my department, the physician and provider recruitment at PCL, we don't make hiring decisions. As thrilled as I am that Dr. Carla Pudi is here and that Dr. Homer is here in the family at PCL, my team did not make that decision. We don't make hiring decisions as recruiters, but we very much have influence over what's on the menu. To those folks that are making hiring decisions, which more than anything else comes down to the physicians and providers within the group that they're going to be practicing at. Their voice in the hiring decision is really louder than anybody else's. And so making sure that we do all that we reasonably can to present them a diverse pool of candidates from which to choose from. And then through efforts like this morning, where we can get providers together, physicians together, and educate them as we are educating ourselves on the need to be deliberate about this, that Peace Health's efforts towards being more diverse isn't going to find success if in the trenches where those hiring decisions are made by those providers, that they don't prioritize it as well. And so just increased collaboration and education, in addition to being humble, deliberate, creative, and flexible, is our orientation in terms of how we deploy those strategies that Lewis has alluded to. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your attention. I appreciate it. Nathan, did you want to add anything to that? It was only a matter of time before one of us didn't unmute ourselves. You're muted, Nathan.
Looks like he's trying to call in as well. Can't hear you, buddy.
If you share in the chat what number you're on, we can try to help and unmute it.
While we are working through to get Nathan connected to sound, Tiffany, kick me off as soon as we are successful there. I just want to comment on a couple thoughts that I had when I was listening to Brett and to Lewis. One of the things you guys mentioned really stood out to me, this idea that we haven't mastered this process of diversifying our workforce, and that's okay. The goal is to say, where are we now and how can we take one step in the right direction, and kind of embracing that growth mindset and learning and acting together. And saying that this is not about perfection, but it's about being really intentional and making sure that we're moving in the right direction. And with that, I think one of the really amazing parts of planning this conference has been the opportunity to meet so many incredible people who are dedicated to putting in time and energy here. So for example, getting to meet Brett and Lewis and Ethan in this process, and all the other folks. I'm going to see if we've got Ethan back on now. Looks like we are still working on getting sound for Ethan. I'm just going to give you guys a little bit of a heads up about what's going to come next in the meantime. So we are about to transition to a speaker panel where we will have Dr. Homer moderating, and we will have a number of our speakers coming back to join us. Also, as part of this panel, we're going to be joined by Dr. Dakota Lane, who's a physician and medical director at the Lummi Tribal Clinic and a Lummi Nation member. He is the father of 3, and he spent the last year leading his community through the COVID pandemic, and he agreed to join us today to share his insight on our speaker panel. So we are excited to welcome Dr. Lane and the rest of the speakers back in a moment. I'm going to try jumping back to Ethan one more time.
All right, can everybody hear me now?
Great.
All right, yay! Well, I'm Ethan Stanley. I'm the University Diversity and Inclusion Recruiter here at Peace Health, and I'm absolutely excited and passionate about my work. I'm a product of diverse parents and upbringing, was raised in the foster care system, and now I'm a foster care father, parent, and really passionate about my work. I'm really committed about providing opportunities for underrepresented minorities in healthcare roles. And I really seek to enrich and diversify Peace Health across all of our networks, and really create a fair and equitable hiring process. You know, I've already started to identify and develop talent and lead efforts to establish and build and retain relationships within our communities. You know, my plan is really to have a talent acquisition approach which appeals to BIPOC students and emerging professionals, and really connect with student associations, career services, affinity groups, and leaders within each of those groups. And really have employer meet and greet, roundtables, coffee talks, classroom presentations, attend viral career hiring events, and, you know, post-COVID, you know, get out there and travel the U.S. And Puerto Rico and meet the students and student body across the nation, and help provide, you know, one-on-one coaching and offering tips to help our students succeed within our programs. You know, we've identified and established early talent programs such as our administration fellowship program. We have summer enrichment programs, clinical experience programs, nursing, pharmacy residency programs, and we're really here to help foster and bridge the gap for underrepresented minorities in our communities and abroad, and to really create opportunities and diversify Peace Health across all of its networks. I know we're short on time. I appreciate the time you've given us, and I hope that you guys look into Peace Health a little more, and we all still collaborate and come together to help bridge that gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you again to Lewis and to Brett. I know that we have a combination of healthcare providers and administrators, among many other members of our community on this call today. And hopefully this is a chance for some of our administrators and our local organizations who are committed to diversifying our workforce and welcoming in more BIPOC individuals and helping grow our workforce in that way. Hopefully this is a chance for you guys to meet and connect as well. So at this point, it's 11 o'clock. It's time to transition over to our speaker panel. I'm not sure if we have Dr. Dakota Lane on the panel yet. I know he had a busy morning, so was going to join us at the last minute. My hope is that he's here. But I'd like to welcome back all of our speakers, and I'm going to transfer it over to Paul Homer to moderate these questions.
Hello, thank you all. Thank you for that presentation and the information on what's happening on a different side of the medical field. Dr. Lane's going to be a little bit late, it sounds like, as you said, Erica. On this panel, we have Dr. Wu, who you heard from earlier, Dr. Lang, who'll be joining us in a little bit, Devyn Nixon, a nurse practitioner that you heard from earlier, and then Lewis as well. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. But I just wanted to start it out. I know that you all cannot necessarily speak for everyone, specifically for a whole race of people, and even in Whatcom and Skagit County. But I just want to hear, starting with you, Devyn, what is the perception of the hospital and clinics in your communities, and why is that?
Wow, that's a big question. I think it depends on who you would pose that question to. When I started with Skagit Regional Health back in 2003, I remember an incident where I was going into work and there was a woman who was clearly very pregnant trying to check in. The person checking her in said, I could overhear them saying, "I just don't understand this, why people would come here and not speak the language." With the little Spanish that I knew, I figured out that she was in labor and needed to go straight to labor and delivery. And I wrote the then CEO and said, to be living in a place that's almost 20% Hispanic, and none of the signs in the ER at that time were in Spanish, except for two. One said, "You are being recorded," and the other said, "Exit." Just imagine that, right? That was 18 years ago. The CEO thankfully was receptive, went through. The signage now is all in English and in Spanish, representative of the community. So I think that Skagit Regional has grown in tremendous, tremendous ways. But it's been a process, and it's been a process that's involved people who see an injustice and speaking up about it, and those who are in a position to help change it, changing it. So to answer your question, I think it's much better now, and I'm sure there's still work to do that we're open to doing.
Excellent, thank you, Devyn. Yeah, that's a good highlight on, making sure we call that out too when you see that as well. Hey, Dakota, hi there. And then Ying, do you want to chime in on this one? Dakota, what we asked was, I know you can't speak for everyone in your community, and specifically for a whole race or tribe or other tribes as well, but just what is the perception of the hospital and clinics in your communities and why? And so we'll have Ying just chime in while you get to joining us.
Hey, this is Yang. I moved outdoors. It's a little windy, but I put the mic inside my coat. Is this working okay? Okay. Yeah. I would have to say two comments about that. A, I don't know. And that in itself speaks volumes, right? We should know. And I would say that my own organization, Family Care Network, is just at its infancy in starting to look at these issues. So we don't, well, maybe somebody knows, but I don't know. And sorry, so that's a concern. The other thing I just want to point out, and not to point fingers at you, Paul, but just to remember that when you ask a person of color about their perceptions, there's an element of lack of safety for that person. It's not always safe for a person of color to answer that question. And, I am nearer to the end of my career than the beginning. I feel pretty secure having been here for as long as I have. But especially for people who are early in their careers, especially for people where their percentage representation is really small, it can be very unsafe to ask questions of that nature. And so just something to be aware of.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ian, for bringing that up. That is very true. And I should have prefaced that maybe opening it, and if people didn't want to answer that question, for sure that I could avoid that too.
And I just want to say, Paul, that's not an accusation at all. It's just, I don't know, here we are. Maybe it's a teachable moment.
Yeah,
and,
no,
I'm
grateful
we all
for
got
your
to be
feedback and
yeah, we all got to
in
be
real time.
uncomfortable to get this job done.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And yeah, creating that space of comfort. Yeah, I also want to, oh, somebody else. Yeah, and I wanted to highlight, in the way that we don't know, it's how do we elicit feedback and what organizations do we work with? Does our hospital work with to elicit those feedback too? And so maybe that would be an area where we could grow in as well. I know Dr. Lucy or Rachel has been working on that too. Dakota, yeah, I will preface this and, if you would like to speak on this at all, and we have other questions too as well.
Sure. I'm sorry for the joining a little late. Just had some other obligations, but for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dakota Lane. I'm the medical director out at the Lummi Tribal Health Clinic, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Certainly, we at our clinic, as well as within our community, I would probably say the experience with Peace Health, the first experience in the ER is probably not the most positive. And I don't think people are surprised by that, just because of the nature of the ER. A few things that are a little bit Lummi specific, and I like stories. And mostly these are stories I get from other patients. And the first one is, for those of you that don't know, we get all of our vaccines from the COVID vaccines from the Indian Health Service and not from the state. So that's one. And then two, we actually design and develop our own vaccine distribution. So we don't have to follow the state guidelines or even for that matter, the CDC guidelines, although it's modeled after the CDC guidelines. So we got our first vaccine December 17th. I think we were one of the first in the county to get it. That means we also were distributing vaccines a lot earlier than the rest of Whatcom County. And a lot of our elders, I just was presenting to the tribe just earlier this morning, 80% of our elders are vaccinated, fully vaccinated. And so in early January, and I heard this multiple times, elders have higher risk. And a lot of them ended up going to the hospital for a variety of reasons. And part of the hospital triage, my understanding is any kind of symptoms you would test for COVID. And a lot of the elders would say, well, you don't need to test me, I'm vaccinated. And a lot on two separate occasions, and I think this is more of, I kind of take it with meaning that we're doing a good job. But on two separate occasions, the nursing staff or medical staff in the ER immediately said, well, how did you get those? And that some of them were 50-year-olds. How did you get those? That's outside the state guidelines. That's illegal almost. And it really soured, and the elders were like, I don't know, I just got the vaccine. They had it and I took it. And why are you upset? And so then pretty soon they just were quiet. And, then they turned around and told me and said, yeah, they were really upset that we got vaccines before everybody else. And there certainly is, it's kind of a little bit of a smaller picture, but it does happen often, that kind of automatic reflex to ask how we have the service that we do. The other one, and I think it's important, not necessarily to highlight Peace Health per se, but the whole ER experience in Washington State, particularly around mental health crisis. This is not a great story. I'm just going to preface that. And I think it's one that mostly the fundamental part is Washington state law. And so just keep that in the back of the mind. We had a young lady, 25-year-old lady with significant mental health and addiction issues, was being followed by our psychiatrist. And from about November till about January, our psychiatrist had made multiple attempts to try to get this patient admitted as an inpatient. She was really struggling with addiction issues to the point, and also in addition to bipolar issues, to the point that she was a significant danger to herself. And part of, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the law. Of course, I looked it up.
Sponsor for this conference. It's happening in.
Say again? I missed that part. Oh, she was just talking. Okay, so there's a Washington state law about how to handle a mental health crisis. And I'm drawing a blank on the name of the law, but you'll get it in a second. One of the procedures is you have these designated mental health, I think they call them DTR, if I remember correctly. Does that sound about right? And that person does the evaluation, the initial evaluation of whether or not to admit a mental health patient. We sent the patient with the psychiatry notes strongly advising that this person be admitted. However, part of the protocol for these particular, I'm calling them DTR, I'm drawing a blank. They'll come to me after this presentation. But nonetheless, there is a designated person who does mental health evaluation. And
CDMHP.
Say again?
CDMHP, County Designated Mental Health Professional, I think is what you're thinking of.
That's exactly who I'm thinking of. I knew it was some acronym. Part of their review by state law does not include psychiatry recommendations. In fact, they don't even have to look at it. And so, unfortunately for this patient, she went to the ER 4 times. And by December, and each time that person followed their protocol, did not look at any of the psychiatry notes and determined that this person was not a risk and sent them on their way. Next thing you know, we see in our regular morning reports that this person was walking down the road, somehow got hit. That person car drove off, and another car was driving by and was on the day and noticed a body in the side of the dike in the water, and it was this lady, and she was still alive. Went to Harborview, had one of her legs amputated, and was going to go through another surgery, and unfortunately did not make it. Our team was watching this in slow motion, and it was not something that when we look at systems, this was the case where every single component of the system failed this particular patient. And I think when our team evaluated it, we believe that the fundamental part of it is the state law and not allowing documentation from a psychiatrist as part of their evaluation. And so that is unfortunate. So it is stories like these. I share these two different stories because they do make it in our community, and they do make our community think twice about whether or not to go to the ER. And I imagine, the reason why I think people think Lummi, we have a politically distinct voice. We have a council, we have a government. And so we do, people probably are more aware. But I would argue that if you ask anybody of the lower socioeconomic area or strata, they probably have similar experiences. And so one of the, and so when I think about this, right, I've worked in the ER, been a family med resident. I get it. Mental health and addiction patients are probably one of the most challenging patients you ever have to deal with. The only way I can think of it is you look at, and I hate to say it, maybe I should not hate to say it, but I think a good way to think of it is, if you look at Disney World or Disneyland, every single person, they strive to make it the most amazing customer experience ever. It's rare that you hear cries of racism, unless it's some particular cartoon, but generally, everybody's welcome there. And as hard as it is, it doesn't really change. This is the customer experience. So when they come into the ER, the people are coming obviously at the most vulnerable moment. They could be in pain, which makes them really irritable to work with. They could be addicted with mental health issues, and you can't really understand where they're coming from. But the onus is on us as providers to take those patients as they are and not where we want them to be. So
Thank you, Dakota.
Those are that's my story, or the
Yeah.
story of some of the experiences we have at Lummi.
No, thank you, Dakota. I think that really does go back to what we talked about of how the system, or how even we as providers or medical staff can exacerbate these inequities in different ways. You know, and what you highlighted too is, are we kind of listed out in a way of providers we wanted to be, and were we the providers we wanted to be in those situations? And I would say we weren't. And you highlighted too that we have to take patients as they are. And no, thank you for saying that, and for sharing that. Really appreciate that. I think there was one question in the chat too of, you know, how from Sudhakar, how can we construct protective practices to prevent the reinforcement of these harmful biases? Or what can we do within our clinics, within ourselves, or to really make this somewhat systematic in some ways?
Is that directed to the entire panel, or
Yeah, anybody can answer that one, if anybody has any thoughts on it.
Well, this is Devyn again. I think as providers of color, we're kind of innately invested into providing a level of care that we may have seen absent in our served in our families' lives. So we are kind of innately insensitive. Much as I hate to say this, I feel like there almost has to be some sort of incentive. Because if there's nothing that's calling out to someone to get informed, to invest their time and energy into learning about health disparities and how they can individually help contribute to closing that gap, I don't know what evokes people to commit to doing a better job of serving our patients in that way. When you were doing your presentation, Dr. Homer, you spoke about that defining moment for yourself. And part of the problem, I think, with systemic racism is so many people are unaffected because they don't have a defining moment with it. And so I think, you know, more conferences like this that are, you know, the beautiful thing about this conference to me is that it's voluntary, you know, it's not mandatory. It's not everyone who's here wants to be here. So more opportunities for people who are willing to invest in the work, to invest in it, and then to go out and be catalysts in the work that we do, in the groups that we serve as a part of. But yeah, incentive, and I don't know really how to incentivize it for people who aren't directly or indirectly affected.
I can speak to that. You know, I had an experience when I was 19 years old and put in charge of a program in St. Louis County that was, you know, directed at young people of lower socioeconomic status. And I had a staff working under me that included people of color who were significantly older than I was. I just happened to have the college credential. And they really opened my eyes. And you know, one of them in particular took the time to speak to me and say, you know, you are more racist than you think. And we had this, I remember we had this meeting with all of these young people in the county offices, and there was a lot of yelling and screaming. And I remember later on, my boss talked to me and said, I was going to come in, but it sounded like it was a good meeting. And you know, they really opened my eyes. And so I will say, as a medical provider, what I have found is that the motivation for doing so is that it makes clinical work way more rewarding, way more fun, way more interesting, and way more successful. You know, when I see my patients in sort of the fullness of who they are, it just goes so much better.
Awesome. Thanks, Ying.
I guess just my two things. I think one of, for all of us that's gone through at least medical training, I think one of the things that third or fourth year that stuck in my mind was if a provider or nurse nursing staff just sitting down gives a sense when a patient's there, gives a sense that you're listening to them. And I know in the chaos of the ER and wanting to get things done quickly, even just sitting down forces you to take 30 seconds. And a few cultural things that I think is worth noting to the people on here about Lummi. We are perfectly okay not speaking. We are perfectly okay if you rush into the ER room or to the patient room and you just start off, why are you here? What's going on? Okay, bye. We are perfectly okay not speaking. And I think it's important to recognize that what's happening is we're listening to you and we want to speak, but we're waiting for you to give us the opportunity to speak. And sometimes it's a really, in Western society, American society, we're used to, as soon as a person's done talking, that's your opening to speak. For out of Lummi, there's a pause. And the best example, my dad is Lummi, my mom is white. I call my mom up, hey mom, how you doing? And she says, I'm doing great. I call my dad up, hey dad, it's nice to talk to you, how you doing? And just when I'm about ready to say, are you there? He goes, I'm doing great. And so that is the difference. And so it's not really, that type of pause is not really amenable to the ER. And that's why I was mentioning it's worthwhile just taking a chance just to sit down and be at their level. So that there's some important little bit cultural miscues that can exacerbate misunderstanding. And so where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so that's why I was suggesting that you sit down because it forces you, there's something about when someone is sitting down and you're standing up here, there's something about looking down at someone that changes the dynamic. So there's some like immediate things you can try. And I know, like I have this, I jokingly, I have the white side of me and the Lummi side of me, and they're always like in constant battle, and it changes depending on who I'm speaking with. And so when I'm with Lummi, like if I have an elder patient, they all know me. They expect me to sit down and not say anything until they've done the speaking. They can go on for the longest story possible. But I have to sit there. It doesn't matter what I need to do next. And it's worth, obviously in the ER, they probably wouldn't expect that of you, but they do expect that of me. And so those are things to consider. And those skills, that's the skill set. Those skills actually pay off when you're dealing with any other patient as well.
And thanks for sharing, Dakota. Lewis, do you have any input on maybe constructive or protective practices to prevent some of these harmful biases?
Yeah, I think what I would like to address to the group of physicians and providers is from somewhat of a team and hierarchy perspective. And, in many ways in clinical environments, physicians and providers are the boss, the top of the hierarchy. And so that your biases become your team's biases. And to the point about, the Disney experience, there's an on stage and an off stage, and it's critical that your off stage activity is as open and sensitive to your coworkers and peers as it is when you're on stage, because that's the reality. And so you may have to check yourself and you may have to think about the words and phrases you use off stage. And I think Dr. Homer spoke about, moving into a room and bringing his bias into a situation. Just consider that in the workspace as well. And so I just want to think about how you engage with other people, how you discuss other people, how you speak about other people on your teams. Everyone absorbs that, and they know and they think, and certainly your team members who are BIPOC will pick up on that and record that in their long-term file of what they have heard you say, which jokes they have heard you make, and which comments you've made about others. And they will use that to determine who they can trust, who they can open up with, who they can be vulnerable around. And that goes for really all spaces, but right now in this context, that's what I would just like to bring up, that you guys are the bosses, people are watching you, and on and off stage, you have to be consistently presenting the right attitude and use the right language as much as possible. No one's perfect, but definitely do your best to be consistent in those actions and words.
Yeah, thank you all for contributing to that. And I think what I heard you all say from Sudhakar, from your question of like constructing some policies, it ends up being a personal level. And what all of you said is something that we each do when we're interacting with the patient that can really change that. And whether it's sitting down, whether it's taking time to listen, whether it's recognizing where other people are struggling and speaking out. And so, and to your point, Louis, that off stage, that is so key of, we're in the room with one face on and out of the room with another, and what that sign out becomes and how that can change direction of care. Again, this one's to the group. I saw Deborah Delaney sort of asked, she asked something similar to this, but sometimes our patients say racist things or do racist things, and or even colleagues. And if whoever wants to take this one first, but I guess I'll just ask you to speak from your personal experience, but how would you like a colleague to respond in a specific moment? Or is there one way to do this? Is it dependent on the situation with a patient saying something?
I generally just call them out. Say that's not appropriate. You can use better language.
Awesome. Right to the point. Yeah, that really gets to it.
Yeah, just if they say, that's not really appropriate language, and try another way.
Yeah, and I think it's part of what the comment I was making earlier, when people are called out and when people realize that they are in fact in the majority of people who disagree with that comment, the silence, if you don't call them out, may give them the perception that they're in the minority of people who disagree with those type of comments. So if you can in any way position your reaction to show that there are more of us who thought that was inappropriate, then that's a good thing, and safety in numbers, and that you feel like you're in a culture and environment that will speak up and push that type of language out.
So yeah, real quick, because this happens all the time with me. As a provider, it's a little different because it's just me in the room with the patient. So I'm just like, yep, we have these one-on-ones. But when I was a bedside nurse, and this happened actually at Peace Health St. Joseph's, I had a patient who went into rapid response, kind of not doing well, and a bunch of people came to the room. Turned out their blood sugar was really low, gave him an Ampity 50. He perked right up and eyes focused in on me. I have so many stories like this. It blows my mind that when people wake up and are orienting, they're racist before they're anything else sometimes. But he just started saying all kinds of N-words. And, you know, I was the primary nurse, and there was probably about 4 or 5 other people in the room. And my colleagues, my nursing colleagues, were vocally liberal and progressive. And our team lead was this woman who was known to be this really conservative Trump supporter and all this. And this is, I'm making the point here because it's kind of funny. This happens all the time. My progressive friends were just in shock. They all just stood there as this patient is calling me every racial slur and N-words and sexual things and every awful thing. And our team lead came in the room and walked right up to him and said, "Hey, that's enough." And he stopped like a child looking at this woman, and it just stopped. And I just remember leaving that day, it was an evening shift, and driving home thinking, dang, you know, we are constantly trying to figure out who's safe. But when it came down to that moment, when the rubber met the road and I felt very unsafe, but I was also the person with all the information about the patient, so I had to stay in the room. The person who spoke up wasn't who maybe everybody would have expected. And I really appreciated that, because I think a lot of times we politicize racism, and racism is just not political. It's just part of the deal here in America. So I hope that answered the question. That was one thing that just came to my mind, calling it out and doing it in a way that's assertive, that's firm.
Thank you all. Yeah, I think getting right to the point is doing that. And I think sometimes, you know, I'm from Nebraska, but I also am a pediatrician. And so conflict is not always something that we enter into that typically, but I think that being direct is, as you all said, is the way to go. And so, you know, hearing it from each of you is very helpful. So I hope that answered a question for many of you. Shar Garrow shared some resources as well in the chat. Dr. Gadzik, do you want to take this over back, and we got to keep moving on. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives here in this space. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of the panelists and to Paul. I think everyone had some great insight to share. And I also appreciate all the questions that came in from our chat box. I just had a couple thoughts when I was listening. One of them is I just want to call out and appreciate the modeling that we just saw of Ying bringing something up that was concerning to him about racism and something we can learn from, and Paul listening and saying thank you. And sometimes I think when you're in that role of getting feedback in the moment, no matter what it's about, it's normal for us to all have a reaction, and we want to have some sort of a defense or something. But I think that skill of saying thank you and then taking a moment to think about it, and then you can always follow up with that person later, and once you've had some time to process the feedback, you know, in a different setting. But I want to thank Ying and Paul for modeling that for us. And then I also want to just appreciate Dr. Lane's comment on calling someone out and mention that this gets easier with practice. I feel like this is something I have been working on for my whole life and will continue to work on and have lots of room for improvement on. And the Pacific Northwest, if you grew up here, it's so passive aggressive that it's just what we learn is to say the really polite thing or to not say something. And it's so much different, I feel like, culturally growing up here compared to like growing up in New York. That's my stereotype of the Seattle area versus New York City. And so I just want to say, like, this is one part of the process, just to say, I can take it upon myself to develop the skill of responding to something when there's a racist comment made or there's a comment that's not productive that's made. I can learn this skill just like I learned how to ride a bike or to, you know, pour a bowl of cereal, and every time it's going to get easier. And that is how, you can be, I'm using Devyn's words here, but a catalyst for change in your group is by being that person who speaks up and calls someone out. And that makes it, that's modeling for people around you to speak up and call someone out. So thank you to all of our panelists. That was a wonderful conversation. Now I've taken up 3 more minutes of our time from our breakup groups. So we're going to switch to breakout groups. You will be automatically divided randomly into smaller groups of individuals. And what I'd like you to do today is briefly introduce yourself, you know, name, where you're from, share your pronouns if you feel comfortable doing that. And then to answer one of 2 questions, whatever you feel most comfortable sharing. And that could be, what is one thing you learned today, or what is one thing that you plan to do with your organization or clinic or workplace or family group to further the goal of health equity? The idea being, what is one actionable step, no matter how big or how small, that you can leave today committing to verbally to this small group? And just, you know, these small group sessions won't be recorded. This is all confidential, but I encourage you guys to push yourself to make a commitment to do something in a positive direction to advance racial health equity in our community. All right, Tiffany, if you can break us out into groups, that would be great. And we will come back. Oh, one more thing. We will come back at 11:50, and we just got a couple really exciting announcements. So I'm going to leave a teaser and ask everyone to please come back after the breakout groups for a couple more super exciting announcements, and then we'll wrap up and get you all onto your day at noon. Thank you so much. Tiffany, if you can split us up, that'd be great. This is Erica Gadzik gathering us all back again. Just give me 1 minute to get to the right place.
You want to
so we have
your name and
about 12 more minutes. I'm going to try and mute everyone. We've got a couple of voices going through. What I'd like to ask is for one person in each group to share a couple of the take-home points or actionable next steps that you guys discussed. If more than one person wants to share, that's great too. But I would love to see kind of some feedback in the chat, and we're going to go through that in just a moment. And then in the meantime, we just got some really exciting news that I'd like to share. First, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel Lucy and Jody Joyce, who's the CEO of North Sound ACH.
Erica, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear and see.
I can see Jody.
Hi, I'm Jody Joyce, the CEO of Unity Care Northwest, a community health center based here in Bellingham, Washington. I am thrilled to announce that Unity Care is going to be contributing $5,000 toward the North Sound Health Equity Scholarship Fund. We are deeply committed to anti-racism and proud to be a seed contributor to this fund. We look forward to helping create a lasting legacy and transformational change by supporting Black, Indigenous, and students of color who are pursuing degrees in the health professions. I invite you to join us in contributing to this all-important fund and transforming our community. Thank you.
Hi, Rika. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. It was bound to happen at least once in this 4-hour period, so snuck it in just in time. So now that I'm unmuted, thank you so much, Jody Joyce. I misspoke earlier. Jody is the CEO of Unity Care Northwest, and we are so appreciative of that contribution. And then I'd also like to turn it over briefly to Liz Baxter, who is the CEO of North Sound ACH, which has been a huge contributor for this event. Liz, are you here?
I am here, if you can hear me. Mm-hmm. I thought for a minute you were announcing that Jody had taken my job, so.
I'm sorry, misspoke. No, too much coffee.
Hi, at the end of the good morning. Just wanted to share, it's been an honor to partner with Chuckanut Health Foundation, Peace Health, Family Care Network in supporting this conference. And just know that the North Sound ACH is committed to having our team help with the next one, so count us in. As a nonprofit created by leaders from across the North Sound region to bridge jurisdictional boundaries and kind of the breakdowns that happen between clinical and community needs, we partner with public health, with hospitals, clinics, community action, fire, EMS, and many others across the 5 counties, including the 8 tribes that are here in the North Sound region. The North Sound ACH actually has a really unique purpose. We exist to create a just and inclusive culture and the necessary conditions required for all community members to thrive. We have been on a 3-year tribal and equity learning journey to try to come up with strategies that will help this region result in everyone having improved equitable well-being. And so if you all are interested, we also do multiple learning sessions throughout the year that are open to community members to join, expanding the knowledge base around advancing equity and addressing structural and systemic racism. We also invest in capacity building, and within that frame, the North Sound ACH is contributing $25,000 to the scholarship fund just to get it seeded. And this morning through the link, I added a personal contribution as well. The notion that we advance learning and opportunities for people of color in health professions is just so incredibly important. And creating a future where you and I and our families are treated with respect, dignity, when we are well as when we need care. If we can impact that, that would be pretty amazing. So just want to thank you all for this opportunity to learn with you and to participate.
Liz, thank you so much. North Sound ACH has been such an essential partner in the planning of this conference, and we are all so appreciative of that generous contribution from your organization, for your leadership in that organization, and also for your personal contribution today. So thank you so much for joining today and helping make this happen. Okay, I'm going to pull open the chat now and take a look at our comments. And in the meantime, I'm wondering if someone on my team in the background can send me an update on where we're at for the final tally for fundraising efforts for this morning. If you can just message that to me, that'd be great. So moving up, lots of great comments here. Ariel says, our group discussed taking the time to allow patients to speak, share their own stories, and also to be intentional about our commitment to health equity, and that the health department is working to use trusted messengers to help with outreach to underserved communities. Absolutely. So specific targeting of underserved communities, that's part of the equity, not just the equality. It's making sure that we're taking extra steps to reach those who are coming from a place with less advantage. Susan Hakeman wrote, our group touched on the importance of sitting down and trying to meet people where they are, among other commitments. Absolutely. Julie Sams, thank you for sharing. They said, we talked about starting with small steps. Feels like a large issue that needs a big coordinated approach, but the important thing is to start working now on what is available to us now. We talked about the need to increase diversity in healthcare education, both in instructional implementation and in recruiting of faculty. So true. And Megan Gruber, our group agreed on the importance of slowing down, of giving patients the time needed to share their story and perspective. And we each voiced the struggle we feel from the healthcare system, which doesn't allow for this time and pressure we feel to produce and see more patients. That is so true. I don't think I know a single healthcare provider who doesn't struggle with that. And, you know, finding a way to maintain your own sanity and prevent burnout, and also, you know, giving the time and attention to every patient who needs it. That's a really hard balance, and it's something I think we are all trying to learn on a daily basis. But I love the idea of slowing down, particularly with patients who may need extra support to advance health equity goals and to help support them in being as healthy as the rest of our patients. Ariel shared the link to the scholarship again. Again, we're going to keep taking donations for that in the days to come. Let's see here. Again, Dr. Wink said, taking time with patients and a learning point of our community's racist history and the hope for change as we move forward. Absolutely. I felt like I didn't know very much at all about Bellingham's history until, you know, the process of researching for this conference. And it was so eye-opening in so many ways. Miriam shared actionable next steps, signage in the office in other languages. One member of our group shared a phone app called Marty, which is an option for better translation and communication in patients whose primary language is not English. And then Rachel Lucy shared, start raising awareness in my clinic so others can join me in taking action, suggesting books in my book club that bring cultural awareness. Absolutely. Deliberate mentoring. I love that word deliberate because it kind of speaks to action and a proactive nature of things as opposed to being a passive bystander. From this group also, I own a clinic and have diverse population served, and I want to take action. I commit to further reflect because I find myself going to problem solving mode and all my solutions have more problems. Yeah, so taking the time to think about these things and putting energy where it's best served, and committing to creating and leading systems where implicit bias turned collective bias doesn't reach our patients. These are all such wonderful, wonderful thoughts. And then Lewis Williams, we spoke about listening more to patients, giving time to hear them completely. We also touched on being allies for people across the gender identity spectrum. That was something that definitely came up in the planning of this conference, was the fact that there are so many other areas of racial inequity and the challenges that face our LGBTQ patients, transgender patients, non-gender binary patients. That could be a whole nother, 3-week-long conference. So there's a lot of room to be involved in this work to advance health equity across the spectrum of need. And so I would encourage everyone to find what area of this brings them the most passion, leaves them feeling the most energized, and to take a step in that area, because there's room for all of us to be involved in the part that makes us most energized and most motivated to help create change. And then Deborah Delaney said, again, that it can be so hard to connect with a patient and care for them in 20 minutes. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second because it's almost noon and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you again to our sponsors who donated to make this conference a free, accessible event for all. Thank you to everyone who joined so that we've had the opportunity to learn and grow together in the spirit of respect and collaboration and social justice, and with the common goal of supporting the health and wellness of every individual in our community. I want to repeat Devyn's message of that you can be a catalyst in the work that you do. We can have, 130 different catalysts from today's meeting, and this will be an annual event. So stay tuned for information about, what's to come in the days to come. Kim posted that the Providers of Color group is having a meeting tomorrow at 4 p.m. via Zoom. And then for those of us at Family Care Network, we are going to have the first meeting of our new diversity and equity and inclusion group in the next several weeks. So keep your eye out for messaging for that. And let's see here. We also welcome any feedback, suggestions, constructive criticism, anything that we can learn from this event to make it better, more applicable, a better use of your time for next year. And let's see if I can scroll down and find our final tally. More people sharing their insight. Thank you. Scrolling down. Wow, okay, so it looks like the total is at $97,050. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. So I bet we could get to 100,000 in the next, hour or so. Just think about if you haven't contributed already, if you have any space in your budget. I also know these are trialing financial times for many individuals. So if you have space to help support furthering the careers of providers, of students of color who are seeking healthcare careers, we would love your support. It's noon, that means it's time to sign off. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for your engagement, and don't hesitate to reach out with questions going forward. Okay, take care everyone, bye.